Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been a cop for 17 years, and I've seen things that would make most people question their faith in humanity. But what happened in Clearwater County, Oregon, still keeps me awake at night. It started with a call that came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in December. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my watch, counting down the minutes until my shift ended when dispatch crackled through the radio. Unit 47, we have a missing person report. Female, 26 years old, name of Rachel Morrison. Last seen approximately 6 hours ago leaving the Riverside Diner on Highway 101. Family is requesting immediate assistance. I was working solo that night. My usual partner, Detective Thompson, was on medical leave after a car accident the month before. The roads were slick with that December rain that turns everything into a sheet of ice, and I was driving carefully along the county's back roads when the call came through. Clearwater County isn't a big place. Maybe 12,000 people spread across forests, farmland, and a few small towns connected by winding two-lane highways. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and a missing person report is taken seriously. I picked up the radio and confirmed I was en route. The dispatcher gave me the address, a small farmhouse about 15 miles outside the main town limits. The Morrison family had been trying to reach Rachel since around 10 p.m., when she was supposed to return home from her shift at the diner. Her car, a red 2018 Toyota Camry, had been found about an hour earlier by a passing motorist, abandoned on the shoulder of Old Mill Road, with the engine still running and the driver's door hanging open. As I drove toward the Morrison residence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a simple case of someone running off with a boyfriend or having car trouble. There was something about the way the dispatcher had described the scene. The engine still running, the door open, the purse and phone left behind. That made my instincts kick in. In 17 years on the force, I'd learned to trust those instincts. The Morrison house sat at the end of a gravel driveway lined with bare oak trees. It was one of those old farmhouses that had been in the same family for generations, with a wraparound porch and windows that glowed yellow against the darkness. I could see several cars parked in the driveway, family members who had gathered to wait for news about Rachel. I knocked on the front door, and it opened almost immediately. A woman in her early 50s stood there, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She had Rachel's bone structure, the same delicate features and light brown hair, though hers was streaked with gray. "Are you the officer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Officer Reynolds with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. You must be Mrs. Morrison." She nodded and stepped aside to let me in. The living room was full of people. An older man I assumed was Rachel's father, a younger woman who looked like she might be a sister, and several others who were probably extended family or close friends. They all looked up at me with the same expression of desperate hope mixed with fear. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Morrison said, standing up from his chair. He was a tall man with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. "We don't know what to do. Rachel's never done anything like this before. She's the most responsible person you'd ever meet." I pulled out my notebook and pen, settling into the familiar routine of gathering information. "Tell me about tonight. When did you last speak with Rachel?" Mrs. Morrison wiped her eyes with a tissue. "She called me around 4 p.m. from the diner. said she was closing up early because it was slow, and she'd be home by 7:30 at the latest. When she didn't show up by 8, I started calling her phone. It went straight to voicemail. Did she mention anything unusual? Anyone bothering her at work? Any problems she was having? Nothing, Mr. Morrison said, shaking his head. Rachel loved that job. She'd been working at the diner for 3 years, saving up money for nursing school. She was supposed to start classes next fall. I wrote down the details, asking about Rachel's relationships, her habits, whether she had any history of depression or substance abuse. The answers painted a picture of a young woman who was exactly what her parents claimed. Responsible, hardworking, with clear goals for her future. No boyfriend drama, no financial troubles, no history of mental health issues. Has anyone been to look at her car yet? I asked. The younger woman, who introduced herself as Rachel's sister Amy, spoke up. We drove out there about an hour ago, but we didn't touch anything. We called you guys first. The car was exactly like the person who found it said. Engine running, door open, her purse was on the passenger seat with her phone and wallet inside. I stood up, closing my notebook. I'm going to head out to the scene now and take a look. I'll need a recent photo of Rachel, and I want you to write down the names and contact information of everyone she works with at the diner. Can you think of anyone else she might have gone to see? Friends? Co-workers? Anyone? Mrs. Morrison handed me a photo from the mantel. Rachel in her high school graduation cap and gown, smiling brightly at the camera. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, the kind of person you'd trust immediately. There's really nobody, Amy said. Rachel didn't have a big social circle. She worked, she came home, she helped Dad with the farm on weekends. She was saving every penny for school. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Morrison grabbed my arm gently. Officer Reynolds, I need to ask you something. Are you going to find my daughter? I looked into his eyes and saw a father's desperation. In 17 years, I'd learned that sometimes the honest answer isn't the one people want to hear, but it's the one they need. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to do everything in my power to find Rachel, but I need you to understand that the first 24 hours are critical. If there's anything at all, that you haven't told me, now is the time. He shook his head. We've told you everything. Rachel is a good girl. She doesn't get into trouble. I nodded and headed for the door. As I walked back to my patrol car, I felt the weight of the family's expectations pressing down on me. The rain had stopped, but the air was cold and heavy with the kind of dampness that seeps into your bones. I sat in my car for a moment, looking back at the farmhouse with its warm lights, and the family inside waiting for news about their missing daughter. In my experience, there are 2 kinds of missing person cases. The first kind involves people who choose to disappear. They're running from something or toward something. And usually they turn up within a day or 2 with a story about needing space or time to think. The second kind involves people who don't choose to disappear, and those cases rarely end well. As I drove toward Old Mill Road, I had a sinking feeling that Rachel Morrison belonged to the second category. The details didn't add up to someone who had left voluntarily. A young woman doesn't abandon her car with the engine running and the door open if she's planning to walk away from her life. She doesn't leave her purse and phone behind if she's meeting someone or going somewhere of her own accord. Old Mill Road was a narrow 2-lane highway that cut through some of the most remote parts of Clearwater County. It was the kind of road that locals used as a shortcut between towns, but it wasn't heavily traveled, especially at night. Dense forest pressed in on both sides, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or logging road that disappeared into the trees. I found Rachel's car about 3 miles from the intersection with Highway 101. It was pulled over on the right shoulder, hazard lights still flashing weakly in the darkness. I parked behind it and called dispatch to request a crime scene unit and a tow truck, though I knew it would be at least an hour before they arrived. Out here, backup was always a long way off. I approached the Toyota carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The engine was still running, just as the family had described, and the driver's door hung open at an odd angle. I could see Rachel's purse on the passenger seat, a small black leather bag that looked expensive. Her phone was visible beside it, the screen dark. I walked around the car, examining the ground for any signs of a struggle. The shoulder was soft from the rain, and I could see tire tracks where the Toyota had pulled over, but the ground was too muddy to make out any clear footprints. I took photos of everything with my phone, knowing that the crime scene unit would do a more thorough job later, but wanting to document what I saw while it was fresh. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 10 feet behind the car, just at the edge of where my flashlight beam reached, I could see what looked like a second set of tire tracks. They were deeper than Rachel's, as if made by a heavier vehicle, and they appeared to have been there more recently. The tracks led from the road shoulder back onto the pavement, heading in the direction of the Forest Service roads that crisscrossed the area. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they disappeared once they reached the asphalt. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the sound of the Toyota's engine idling and the distant hum of traffic on Highway 101. The forest around me was completely silent. No night, birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I was about to return to Rachel's car when I heard something that made me freeze. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it sounded like a voice calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. I strained to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. It could have been an animal, or the wind moving through the branches, or my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But something about it made me think of a person calling for help, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in those thousands of acres of forest, Rachel Morrison was trying to find her way home. I called out into the darkness, my voice echoing off the trees. "Rachel, this is Officer Reynolds with the Sheriff's Department. If you can hear me, call out." I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Nothing came back except the sound of my own breathing and the steady idle of the Toyota's engine. I made the decision to enter the tree line, following what I thought might be a path through the undergrowth. The beam of my flashlight seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness of the forest. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally loud, and more than once I had to stop and listen, convinced I was hearing footsteps that weren't my own. The forest floor was thick with decades of fallen leaves, now soggy from the December rain. My boots squelched with each step, and I could feel the dampness seeping through my socks. The trees here were mostly Douglas fir and cedar, their branches so thick overhead that even in daylight very little sun would have penetrated to the ground. At night, with only my flashlight for illumination, it felt like walking through a tunnel that went on forever. I'd gone maybe 50 yards when I found something that made me stop cold. Caught on a low branch about chest height was a piece of fabric, a small triangle of red material that looked like it had been torn from a shirt or jacket. I took out my phone and photographed it from multiple angles before carefully removing it with my pen and placing it in an evidence bag I always kept in my jacket pocket. The fabric was recent. It wasn't weathered or faded the way something would be if it had been hanging there for months. And according to the family, Rachel had been wearing a red sweater when she left for work that morning. My heart rate picked up as I continued deeper into the woods, following what was becoming a more defined path. About 100 yards in, I found the first clear footprint. It was in a patch of mud beside a fallen log, and it was definitely made by a woman's shoe. Small, with a distinctive tread pattern that I photographed carefully. But what worried me was that it was pointing deeper into the forest, away from the road and away from any kind of help. I followed the trail for another 20 minutes, finding occasional footprints and broken branches that suggested someone had passed this way recently. But then the trail simply vanished. I stood in a small clearing, turning my flashlight in all directions, but I couldn't find any sign of where the path continued. It was as if whoever I'd been following had simply disappeared into thin air. That's when I heard it again. The voice I'd heard earlier, but this time it was clearer. It was definitely a woman's voice, and it was calling out what sounded like, "Help me." The sound seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine the direction. "Rachel," I shouted back, louder this time. "Where are you? Keep calling out." But again, silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sound that might lead me to her. My radio crackled with static, but when I tried to call dispatch, I got nothing but interference. The thick canopy of trees was blocking the signal. I made the difficult decision to head back to the road. I needed to get backup, needed to organize a proper search party with dogs and equipment. As much as I wanted to keep looking on my own, I knew I was more likely to get lost than to find Rachel if I continued stumbling around in the dark. The walk back to the road seemed to take forever. More than once, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched, that there was someone or something moving through the trees just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I kept spinning around, shining the light into the darkness, but I never saw anything. When I finally made it back to Rachel's car, I found that the crime scene unit had arrived. 2 technicians were already at work, photographing the vehicle and the surrounding area. Detective Sarah Chen, who'd been called in despite it being well past midnight, was standing beside the Toyota with a clipboard, making notes. "Reynolds," she said when she saw me approaching. "What did you find in there?" I showed her the evidence bag with the piece of red fabric and told her about the footprints and the voice I'd heard. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "We need to get a search team out here at first light," she said. "How familiar are you with this area?" "I've patrolled these roads for years, but I've never been deep into those woods. There are logging roads that crisscross through there, some old hunting cabins, but most of it is just wilderness. If someone wanted to hide something or someone, it would be the perfect place." Detective Chen nodded grimly. "The family says Rachel had no reason to get out of her car voluntarily. No history of depression, no boyfriend problems, no financial troubles. And you're right about the second set of tire tracks. We found them too. Something bigger than her Toyota, probably a truck or SUV. We spent the next hour processing the scene. The technicians found Rachel's fingerprints on the steering wheel and door handle, but no evidence of anyone else having been in the car. Her purse contained her wallet with $43 in cash, her driver's license, and several credit cards. Her phone showed no recent calls or text messages after 6:30 p.m., when she'd apparently texted her sister to say she was leaving work. "Here's what bothers me," Detective Chen said as we watched the technicians work. "If someone forced her to pull over, why leave the car running? Why not take it to throw us off the trail? And why abandon it here, on a road where it would be found quickly?" I'd been thinking the same thing. Maybe they were interrupted. Or maybe they wanted the car to be found. Maybe they wanted us to know that something had happened to her. Or maybe they wanted to lead us into those woods, Chen said quietly, away from the real crime scene. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If someone had taken Rachel, they might have left her car as a deliberate distraction. knowing that law enforcement would focus their search efforts on the forest instead of looking elsewhere. By 4 a.m., we had done everything we could do at the scene. The Toyota was loaded onto a flatbed truck and taken to the police impound lot for further examination. Detective Chen and I agreed to meet at the station at 8 a.m. to coordinate the search efforts. As I drove back toward town, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice I'd heard in the woods. I'd been a cop long enough to know that sometimes your mind plays tricks on you, especially when you're tired and working a high-stress case. But I was certain I'd heard someone calling for help, and I was equally certain it had been a woman's voice. The sun was starting to rise by the time I got home, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. I lived in a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, a place I'd rented when I first moved to Clearwater County and never bothered to leave. It was sparse but comfortable, with just enough room for my books, my television, and the small collection of model airplanes I'd been building since I was a kid. I tried to get a few hours of sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's car sitting empty on the roadside with the door hanging open. I thought about her parents, probably still awake and waiting by the phone for news. I thought about the piece of red fabric I'd found and the footprints leading deeper into the forest. Most of all, I thought about that voice calling out in the darkness, and the terrible possibility that Rachel Morrison was somewhere out there, alive and afraid, waiting for someone to find her. At 7:30 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep and made myself a pot of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, looking out the window at the quiet streets of Clearwater County's main town. It was the kind of place where people still waved to each other from their front porches, where the biggest crime was usually someone's teenager spray painting graffiti on the water tower. We weren't equipped for something like this. A young woman vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the echo of a voice calling for help in the darkness. I showered and put on a fresh uniform, then drove to the station. Detective Chen was already there, along with Sheriff Martinez and 2 state police officers who'd been called in to assist with the search. They were gathered around a large map of Clearwater County, marking off areas where search teams would be deployed. "Reynolds," Sheriff Martinez said when I walked in, "Chen tells me you found evidence in the forest last night. I want you to lead one of the search teams back to that area." I nodded, accepting the assignment. But as I looked at the map, with its thousands of acres of wilderness marked in green, I couldn't help but feel that we were looking for a needle in a haystack. If someone had taken Rachel Morrison, they'd had a 12-hour head start, and they could have taken her anywhere. The search began at 9 a.m. sharp. We had 4 teams of 6 people each, including local volunteers who knew the terrain. My team consisted of myself, 2 state troopers, and 3 members of the county's volunteer search and rescue unit. We were equipped with GPS devices, 2-way radios, and enough supplies for a full day in the woods. I led my team back to the spot where I'd found the red fabric the night before. In the daylight, the forest looked different, less threatening, but somehow more vast. The morning sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. "This is where I found the first piece of evidence," I told the team, pointing to the branch where the fabric had been caught. The footprints I followed led roughly in that direction, toward the northeast. One of the search and rescue volunteers, a weathered man named Tom Bradley, who'd lived in these parts his whole life, studied the terrain with an experienced eye. "There's an old logging road about 2 miles in that direction," he said. "Hasn't been used in maybe 15 years, but it's still passable if you know where you're going." We spread out in a line, staying within sight of each other as we moved through the forest. Every few minutes, someone would call out Rachel's name, and we'd all stop to listen for a response, The woods were alive with the normal sounds of daytime: birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant hum of insects, but no human voice answered our calls. About an hour into the search, one of the state troopers found something that made us all gather around. It was another piece of fabric, this one larger than what I'd found the night before, caught on a thorny bush about waist high. The color matched the previous piece exactly. "She was definitely here," the trooper said, photographing the evidence before carefully removing it. "And if she's leaving a trail like this, either she's doing it deliberately to help us find her, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he was thinking. Or someone else was leaving the trail to lead us in a specific direction. We continued following the sporadic trail of fabric and broken branches for another hour. The path seemed to wind deliberately through the densest parts of the forest, areas where the undergrowth was thick enough to slow our progress, and the canopy overhead blocked out most of the sky. I found myself constantly checking my GPS device, making sure we weren't getting turned around. It was Tom Bradley who found the next significant piece of evidence. He'd been examining a fallen tree that blocked part of the path when he called out for the rest of us to come look. "Fresh blood," he said, pointing to dark stains on the bark. "Not much, but it's recent, maybe 12 hours old, judging by the color." My stomach tightened as I looked at the evidence. The blood wasn't arterial spray or the kind of massive bleeding you'd see from a serious injury, but it was enough to suggest that someone had been hurt. I took photos and called it in to Detective Chen over the radio. "Ah, copy that, Reynolds," her voice crackled back. "Any other signs of struggle in the area?" I looked around carefully before responding. "Negative. The undergrowth is disturbed, but it could just be from someone passing through. No obvious signs of a fight. Keep following the trail, but be careful. If someone is leading you in a specific direction, you might be walking into something." The warning hung heavy in the air as we continued deeper into the forest. The other teams were reporting similar findings: occasional pieces of fabric, broken branches, a few more spots of blood. But no sign of Rachel Morrison herself. By noon, we'd traveled nearly 3 miles from the road, and I was starting to worry about our own safety. The forest was more remote than I'd ever been, and the GPS readings showed we were approaching the edge of the county, near the border with federal wilderness lands. If Rachel was out here somewhere, she was a long way from any kind of help. That's when we found the cabin. It appeared suddenly through the trees, a small wooden structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The roof was partially collapsed, and thick vines covered most of the walls. But what caught my attention immediately was the chimney. There was fresh smoke rising from it. I signaled for the team to stop and radioed our position to the other search teams. "We've got a structure here, appears to be occupied. Proceeding with caution." We approached the cabin slowly, spreading out to cover all possible exits. The building was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, with a single door and 2 windows. Both windows were covered with what looked like old blankets or tarps, making it impossible to see inside. I could hear voices coming from within. At least 2 people, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. One of the voices was higher-pitched, possibly female. My heart rate spiked as I considered the possibility that we'd found Rachel. "Police!" I called out, my weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "This is Officer Reynolds with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. I need whoever's inside to come out with their hands visible." The voices stopped immediately. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of wood in the fireplace and the nervous breathing of my search team. Then the door opened slowly, and an elderly man stepped out. He was probably in his 70s, with a long gray beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. His eyes were wide with fear as he raised his hands above his head. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice shaking. "I ain't done nothing wrong." "Sir, I need you to step away from the door and keep your hands where I can see them," I said, maintaining my professional tone despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Is there anyone else inside with you?" The old man nodded. "My granddaughter, she's sick. We've been living out here since her mama died last spring." I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. This wasn't Rachel Morrison, but it was still a situation that needed to be handled carefully. "I need to see your granddaughter, sir. We're looking for a missing person, and we need to make sure she's safe." The man called back into the cabin, and a few moments later, a young woman appeared in the doorway. She was probably in her early 20s, with long dark hair and the same wary expression as her grandfather. She was clearly ill, pale and thin, with a persistent cough that racked her small frame. "We don't have any identification," the old man said apologetically. "Lost everything in a fire last year. Been living off the land ever since." I holstered my weapon and approached them more calmly. "What are your names?" "I'm Eddie Korchak," the old man said. "This is my granddaughter, Sarah. We ain't bothering nobody out here." I showed them the photo of Rachel Morrison. "Have you seen this woman? She went missing last night, and we've been following a trail that led us here." Both Eddie and Sarah shook their heads. "Haven't seen nobody in weeks," Eddie said. "Just been the two of us." I believed them. There was something genuine about their fear and confusion that convinced me they weren't involved in Rachel's disappearance. But their presence here raised new questions about the trail we'd been following. "Eddie, have you noticed anything unusual in the past day or two? Any sounds? Any other people in the area?" The old man scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, there was something last night. Sarah and we heard a truck driving around on the old logging roads. Seemed strange because nobody ever comes back here anymore." My pulse quickened. "What time was this?" "Must have been around midnight, maybe a little after. Woke us both up because it was so unusual. The truck was driving real slow, like maybe whoever was in it was looking for something." Sarah spoke up for the first time, her voice weak but clear. "Granddad, tell him about the screaming." Eddie looked uncomfortable. "Well, I ain't sure it was screaming. Could have been an animal. But around the same time we heard the truck, there was this sound. Like someone calling out, a woman's voice, I think." The pieces were starting to come together in my mind, and none of them painted a good picture. Someone had brought Rachel to this remote area, possibly in a truck, and she'd been calling for help in the darkness while I'd been stumbling around in the woods below. I radioed Detective Chen with our findings and requested that social services be contacted about Eddie and Sarah's situation. The young woman clearly needed medical attention, and living in an abandoned cabin in the middle of winter wasn't sustainable for either of them. While we waited for backup to arrive, I asked Eddie to show me the logging roads he'd mentioned. He led us through the trees to what had once been a dirt road, but was now mostly overgrown with brush and small trees. However, I could see recent tire tracks in the soft earth, deep ruts made by a heavy vehicle with large tires. "The truck came from that direction," Eddie said, pointing toward the northwest. "Went past our cabin and continued up toward the old quarry." I'd heard of the quarry, but had never been there. According to the county maps, it was an abandoned limestone quarry that had been shut down in the 1980s. It was at the very edge of our jurisdiction, in an area so remote that even the logging companies had given up on it years ago. "How far is it to the quarry?" I asked. "Maybe 2 miles following the logging road," Eddie said. "But it's rough going. Haven't been up there myself in maybe 5 years." I made the decision to pursue the lead. While we waited for social services to arrive for Eddie and Sarah, I organized my search team to continue following the logging road toward the quarry. Detective Chen's voice crackled over the radio, expressing concern about splitting our resources. But I convinced her that the truck Eddie had heard might be our best lead yet. The logging road was indeed rough going. Years of weather had washed out sections, and fallen trees blocked the path in multiple places. We had to climb over obstacles and push through undergrowth that seemed determined to slow our progress. But the tire tracks were definitely there, and they were recent. As we climbed higher into the hills, the forest around us began to change. The trees were older here, some of them massive Douglas firs that must have been growing for centuries. The canopy was so thick that even the midday sun barely penetrated to the ground level, creating an eerie twilight atmosphere. After an hour of difficult hiking, we reached the quarry. It was larger than I'd expected, a massive scar in the landscape where limestone had been carved out of the hillside. The quarry walls dropped down about 50 feet to a pool of dark water at the bottom. Old mining equipment sat rusted and abandoned around the rim, and several buildings that had once housed offices and equipment storage stood empty and crumbling. But what made my blood run cold was what we found in one of the buildings. The structure had once been an office or equipment storage facility, with concrete walls and a metal roof that had partially caved in over the years. The door hung open on rusted hinges, and as we approached, I could smell something that made my stomach turn. Not decay exactly, but something organic and wrong. Inside, we found evidence that someone had been using the building recently. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt outside, and the interior showed signs of recent occupation. A sleeping bag was spread out on the concrete floor, along with several bottles of water, canned food, and what looked like medical supplies. But it was the rope that made my hands shake as I photographed it. Heavy nylon rope, the kind used for climbing or securing loads, was coiled neatly in one corner. Some of it had been cut into shorter lengths, and I could see what looked like bloodstains on several pieces. "Jesus," one of the state troopers whispered behind me. Someone was definitely holding someone here. I called Detective Chen immediately, my voice tighter than I intended. "Chen, we need the full crime scene unit up here. We've found what looks like a holding location. Evidence of recent occupation, restraints, possible blood evidence." "Copy that. How recent?" I looked around the building more carefully, noting details I'd missed in my initial survey. The food containers were still damp with condensation. The sleeping bag was still warm to the touch. Someone had been here very recently, possibly as recently as this morning. "Very recent," I replied. "Whoever was here might have left when they heard us coming. Reynolds, I want you and your team out of there now. Fall back to a safe distance and wait for backup. If this is an active crime scene, the perpetrator might still be in the area." I wanted to argue, wanted to continue searching for Rachel while the trail was still hot, but I knew Chen was right. We'd already contaminated the scene by entering the building, and if we were dealing with someone dangerous, my small search team wasn't equipped for a confrontation. As we retreated from the quarry, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us was completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that happens when something predatory is nearby, when all the prey animals have gone into hiding. We made it back to Eddie's cabin without incident, but the walk felt endless. Every shadow between the trees could have been hiding someone. Every breaking branch could have been footsteps following us. By the time we reached the relative safety of the clearing around the cabin, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Eddie and Sarah were still there, now accompanied by a social worker who'd hiked in to assess their situation. The young woman was being treated by a paramedic who'd come with the social worker, and it was clear that she needed immediate medical attention. "Officer Reynolds," the social worker said as I approached, "I need to get Sarah to a hospital as soon as possible. She's showing signs of pneumonia, and living in these conditions has made it much worse." I nodded, but my attention was focused on Eddie. "Sir, I need to ask you some more questions about what you heard last night. You said there was a truck on the logging roads?" Eddie looked nervous, glancing between me and the social worker. "I already told you everything I know. I need you to think harder. Did you hear the truck leave? Did it sound like it went back the way it came? Or did it continue in another direction?" The old man closed his eyes, concentrating. "Now that you mention it, I don't think I heard it leave. The engine sound just stopped, like maybe they turned it off somewhere nearby." A chill ran down my spine. If the truck was still in the area, if whoever had taken Rachel was still here, then she might still be alive. But it also meant that we were potentially dealing with someone who was desperate enough to stay close to an active crime scene. Detective Chen arrived with the full crime scene unit about an hour later, along with additional state police officers and a K-9 unit. While the technicians processed the abandoned building at the quarry, Chen and I coordinated an expanded search of the surrounding area. "The dog is picking up a scent," the K-9 handler reported over the radio. "Human scent. Female. Leading away from the quarry toward the north." We followed the search dog and its handler through increasingly difficult terrain. The forest here was old growth, with massive trees and thick undergrowth that made progress slow and exhausting. But the dog was confident, following a scent trail that was invisible to the rest of us. After about 30 minutes of hiking, the dog led us to another clearing, this one containing the remnants of what looked like an old hunting camp. There were several structures: a main cabin that was in better condition than Eddie's place, a smaller outbuilding that might have been a storage shed, and what looked like the remains of a fire pit. But it was the pickup truck parked behind the main cabin that made my heart race. It was a dark blue Ford F-150, maybe 10 years old, with mud caked on the tires and sides. The license plate was obscured by dirt, but I could make out enough numbers to run a check. "Vehicle located," I radioed to Chen. "Dark blue Ford pickup, Oregon plates, partial, David Charlie 7, requesting backup before approaching." "Copy that. State police units are en route. Do not approach the vehicle until backup arrives." We took cover behind the trees and waited, watching the cabin for any sign of movement. The windows were covered with what looked like old newspapers or magazines, making it impossible to see inside. Smoke was rising from the chimney, suggesting that someone was inside. The wait felt eternal. Every minute that passed was another minute that Rachel Morrison might be suffering, might be dying. I found myself checking my watch obsessively, counting the seconds until backup would arrive. When the state police units finally reached our position, we had enough personnel to surround the cabin properly. Detective Chen took charge of the operation, positioning officers at all possible exits while she and I approached the front door. "Police!" Chen called out in a voice that carried clearly through the forest. "This is Detective Chen with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. I need everyone inside to come out with their hands visible." Silence. No movement from inside the cabin, no response to our commands. Chen tried again, louder this time. "We have the building surrounded. Come out now and no one gets hurt." Still nothing. After waiting another minute, Chen made the decision to approach closer. We moved carefully toward the front door, weapons drawn, every sense alert for any sign of movement or threat. The door was slightly ajar, and I could smell wood smoke mixed with something else, something that made my stomach clench with dread. Chen nodded to me, and I pushed the door open with my foot while she covered me with her weapon. The cabin was empty, but the evidence of what had happened there was unmistakable. In the center of the single room, a chair had been placed directly under an overhead beam. The chair was wooden, heavy, and there were rope marks on the arms and legs where someone had been restrained. The floor around the chair was stained with what was clearly blood, and scattered nearby were items that made my hands shake as I photographed them. Rachel Morrison's driver's license, her car keys, a torn piece of red fabric that matched the sweater her family said she'd been wearing. "She was here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But she's not here now." Chen was already coordinating with the other units, setting up a perimeter search of the immediate area. But I had a sick feeling that we were too late, that whoever had taken Rachel had moved her again when they realized we were closing in. The K9 unit was brought into the cabin, and the dog immediately picked up another scent trail leading away from the building toward the west. But this trail was different from the others we'd followed. The dog seemed less certain, stopping frequently and circling back as if the scent was weak or confused. "The trail goes cold about 50 yards from the cabin," the handler reported. "Either the scent is being masked by something, or it ends at a vehicle." We found the tire tracks 20 minutes later. Fresh ruts in the soft earth where a vehicle had been parked and then driven away. The tracks led to an old logging road that connected to the main Forest Service road system. From there, whoever we were chasing could have gone anywhere. As the crime scene technicians processed the cabin, I found myself standing outside, staring up at the darkening sky. We'd been searching for nearly 10 hours, following a trail that had led us to multiple crime scenes, and we were no closer to finding Rachel Morrison alive than we'd been that morning. Detective Chen approached me, her expression grim. "The blood evidence is being fast-tracked to the lab, but preliminary field tests confirm it's human blood, type O positive, which matches Rachel's medical records." I nodded, though the information felt like a physical blow. "How much blood?" "Enough to indicate a serious injury, but not necessarily fatal. She could still be alive, Reynolds." "Could be." The words hung in the air between us like a prayer and a curse. After 17 years in law enforcement, I'd learned that "could be" was often the best you could hope for in cases like this. But as we prepared to expand the search to include the entire road system leading out of the forest, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The person we were chasing had stayed one step ahead of us all day, always moving Rachel just before we arrived. They knew the area well, knew the roads and the hiding places, and they seemed to know exactly how long they could stay in one location before law enforcement would find them. The question that kept nagging at me was simple but terrifying. If they were that good at staying ahead of us, what did they plan to do with Rachel Morrison? By evening, we had roadblocks set up on every major route leading out of Clearwater County. Detective Chen had contacted the FBI's regional office, and federal agents were en route to assist with what was now officially classified as a kidnapping case. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were thinking about this all wrong. I was sitting in my patrol car at one of the roadblock positions, sipping cold coffee and watching traffic, when my radio crackled with a call that changed everything. "All units, we have a 911 call from a female caller claiming to be Rachel Morrison. Call is coming from a landline. Location shows as Miller's gas station on Highway 18. Caller says she escaped and needs immediate assistance." My heart stopped. Miller's gas station was only about 15 miles from where we'd found the abandoned cabin, but it was in the opposite direction from where we'd been focusing our search. I was the closest unit to that location. "Unit 47 responding," I radioed back, already turning my patrol car around and hitting the lights and siren. ETA approximately 12 minutes. The drive to Miller's gas station felt like the longest 12 minutes of my career. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. It could be a trap. It could be someone else calling and claiming to be Rachel. It could be Rachel, but she could be seriously injured. I called ahead to request an ambulance to meet me at the location. Miller's gas station was one of those old-fashioned places that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1970s. It sat at the intersection of Highway 18 and a county road, surrounded by farmland and forest. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot when I arrived, and I could see a young woman standing inside the building, talking to the clerk behind the counter. Even from a distance, I could tell it was Rachel Morrison. She matched the photo her family had given me, but she looked like she'd been through hell. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair was matted, and even through the glass doors, I could see that she was shaking. I approached the building carefully, my hand resting on my weapon but not drawing it. Through the windows, I could see that Rachel was alone with the clerk, an elderly man who looked nervous but not threatened. The electronic chime announced my entrance, and Rachel spun around to face me. When she saw my uniform, her knees gave out, and she started crying. Not the quiet tears of relief, but the kind of sobbing that comes from deep trauma. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Reynolds with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department," I said, keeping my voice calm and reassuring. "Are you Rachel Morrison?" She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. I could see that she had injuries, a cut on her forehead that had dried blood around it, bruises on her arms, and what looked like rope burns around her wrists. "The ambulance is on its way," I told her. "You're safe now. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere else? Do you need immediate medical attention?" "I'm okay," she managed to whisper, though it was clear she was anything but okay. I got away from him." I guided her to a chair near the front of the store while we waited for the ambulance. The gas station clerk, whose name tag identified him as Earl, brought her a bottle of water and a clean towel. "She came running out of the woods about 10 minutes ago," Earl told me quietly. "Scared the hell out of me. She was crying and saying someone was chasing her. I let her use the phone to call 911. I knelt down beside Rachel's chair, speaking in the gentlest voice I could manage. "Rachel, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. The person who took you, are they still out there? Could they be following you?" She looked up at me with eyes that were wide with fear. "I don't know. I think I lost him, but he knows these woods. He knows them better than anyone. Can you tell me what he looks like?" Rachel took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself enough to answer. "He's maybe 40 years old, tall, with dark hair and a beard. He was wearing camouflage clothes and work boots. He drives a blue pickup truck." The description matched what we'd already gathered from the evidence, but hearing it from Rachel herself made it real in a way that crime scenes and bloodstains couldn't. "Do you know his name? Did he tell you anything about himself?" "He called himself Dale," she said, "but I don't know if that's his real name. He said he'd been watching me for weeks, said he knew my schedule at the diner." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was a stalker who had been planning Rachel's abduction for some time. The ambulance arrived, and I watched as the paramedics examined Rachel's injuries. They were consistent with what I'd expect from someone who'd been held captive and had escaped through rough terrain. The cut on her forehead needed stitches, and her wrists showed clear signs of being bound with rope, but nothing appeared to be life-threatening. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, I asked if she felt strong enough to answer a few more questions. "Where did he take you?" "We found some locations in the forest, but we need to know if there are others." Rachel closed her eyes, and I could see her struggling with the memories. There were 3 places. First was an old building near a big hole in the ground. "The quarry," I confirmed. then a cabin where he tied me to a chair. But when he heard helicopters, he moved me again. She paused, shuddering at the memory. The last place was underground, like a bunker or something. He said it was where I was going to stay permanently. Underground. We hadn't found anything like that in our searches. If this Dale character had access to an underground bunker or shelter, it would explain how he'd been able to stay hidden despite our extensive search efforts. Rachel, this is very important. Can you tell me how to find this underground location? She shook her head slowly. I was blindfolded when he took me there, but when I escaped, I just kept running toward the sound of cars. I could hear traffic in the distance, so I knew there was a road. How long were you in the underground location? Maybe 6 hours. It was hard to tell. He left me there alone while he went to check on things. That's when I managed to get loose from the ropes and find a way out. The paramedics were getting impatient, wanting to get Rachel to the hospital for proper treatment. I gave her my card and told her I'd be by the hospital later to take a more detailed statement. But for now, she needed medical attention. As the ambulance pulled away, I stood in the parking lot of Miller's gas station, trying to process what I'd learned. Rachel was alive, which was the best possible outcome we could have hoped for. But Dale was still out there, and according to Rachel, he had access to underground hiding places that we hadn't even begun to search for. I called Detective Chen and filled her in on Rachel's rescue and the new information we'd gathered. Within an hour, we had teams searching the area between the last known location and Miller's gas station, looking for any signs of underground structures. But as the hours passed and our searches turned up nothing, I began to realize that Dale had probably abandoned his underground hideout the moment Rachel escaped. He was smart enough to know that she would lead us back to him, and he was experienced enough in these woods to disappear without a trace. The forensic evidence from the various crime scenes would eventually give us DNA and fingerprints that could identify Dale if he was in the system. The description Rachel provided would help us create a composite sketch. But I had the sinking feeling that by the time we processed all the evidence and got the word out to other law enforcement agencies, Dale would be long gone. 3 days later, the FBI identified Dale as Dale Marcus Hoffman, a 42-year-old man with a history of stalking and assault charges in 3 different states. He'd been living off the grid in Clearwater County for approximately 8 months, using the identity of a dead man and working odd jobs for cash. The underground bunker Rachel had described was never found, despite extensive searches using ground-penetrating radar and specialized equipment. Dale's blue pickup truck was discovered abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Portland, Oregon, wiped clean of fingerprints and forensic evidence. Rachel Morrison recovered from her physical injuries within a few weeks, but the psychological trauma would take much longer to heal. She moved away from Clearwater County before Christmas, saying she couldn't bear to stay in a place where she might run into her abductor again. Dale Marcus Hoffman was never caught. For 6 months after Rachel's rescue, reported sightings came in from across the Pacific Northwest, but none of them panned out. He had simply vanished, like he'd never existed at all. But that's not the end of the story, because 3 months after Rachel's rescue, I started getting calls about another missing person. Then another. Young women, all in their 20s. All disappearing from small towns within a 100-mile radius of Clearwater County. The pattern was always the same: cars found abandoned with the engines still running, personal belongings left behind, no signs of struggle. And always, the disappearances happened near heavily forested areas where someone could easily hide an underground bunker. I've been tracking these cases on my own time, maintaining a file that now contains information on 7 missing women across 4 states. The FBI has a task force working on it, but resources are limited, and the connections between the cases are circumstantial at best. But I know it's him. I know Dale Marcus Hoffman is still out there, still taking women, still using his knowledge of remote wilderness areas to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. And I know that somewhere out there, probably within driving distance of where I'm sitting right now, there's an underground bunker where women are being held captive by a man who's gotten very good at not being found. The breakthrough came 11 months after Rachel's rescue, and it came from the most unlikely source imaginable. I was working a routine traffic stop on Highway 101 when my radio crackled with an emergency call that made my blood freeze. All units, we have a report of a deceased male at the Riverside Diner on Highway 101. Caller reports possible suicide, requesting immediate response. The Riverside Diner, the same place where Rachel Morrison had worked, where she'd been last seen before her abduction. I was less than 5 miles away. I arrived at the scene before the ambulance, before Detective Chen, before anyone else. The caller turned out to be Martha Collins, the diner's owner, a woman in her 60s who'd been running the place for 30 years. She was standing in the parking lot, shaking and chain-smoking cigarettes when I pulled up. "He's in the men's restroom," she told me, her voice barely steady. "I found him about 20 minutes ago when I came in to open up. Door was locked from the inside, but I could smell. I knew something was wrong." I approached the restroom door carefully, though Martha was right about the smell. Even through the closed door, the odor of death was unmistakable. I knocked first, calling out to identify myself, though I knew there would be no response. The door was indeed locked from the inside, but the old mechanism was loose enough that I could work it open with my pocket knife. When I pushed the door open, I found him. He was slumped against the far wall, a .38 revolver on the floor beside his right hand. Dark hair, beard, approximately 40 years old. Even in death, even with the damage from the gunshot wound, I recognized him immediately from Rachel's description and the composite sketch we'd distributed. Dale Marcus Hoffman had come back to where it all started, and he'd ended it on his own terms. But that wasn't what made my hands shake as I secured the scene and waited for the crime scene unit. It was what he'd left behind, a manila envelope addressed to Officer Reynolds, Clearwater County Sheriff's Department, in careful block letters. Inside the envelope was a handwritten confession that ran to 14 pages. But more than that, it was a detailed map of underground bunkers and hiding places across 4 states, along with what appeared to be a list of names and dates going back nearly 5 years. I read the first few lines while sitting in my patrol car, waiting for Detective Chen to arrive. "My name is Dale Marcus Hoffman, and I am writing this because I cannot continue to live with what I have done. By the time you read this, I will be dead, but the women I have taken deserve to have their families know the truth. I have been taking young women for 4 years and 7 months. Some of them I released after a few days. Some of them I kept longer. Some of them are still alive. And this map will tell you where to find them." Detective Chen arrived 15 minutes later, along with the county coroner and a full crime scene unit. But by then, I had already called the FBI and read enough of Hoffman's confession to know that this was bigger than anything we'd imagined. The confession detailed 23 abductions across Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and Idaho. Rachel Morrison had been number 16 on his list. According to his notes, 7 of the women had been released after what he called observation periods, ranging from 2 days to 2 weeks. 4 had died, 1 from medical complications, 3 from what he described as accidents during transport. But 12 women, according to his confession, were still alive in underground bunkers that he'd constructed over a period of years. The confession included detailed maps showing the locations of each bunker, along with notes about the supplies and security measures he'd put in place. Within 6 hours, we had FBI teams dispatched to all 12 locations. Within 24 hours, 9 women had been found alive in underground shelters that were far more sophisticated than anything we'd imagined. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were engineered structures with ventilation systems, running water, and enough supplies to sustain multiple people for months. The women were in various stages of physical and psychological trauma, but they were alive. Some had been missing for over a year. 3 of the bunkers were empty, suggesting that the women held there had either died or been moved to other locations that weren't included in Hoffman's map. The media coverage was intense. "Underground Serial Kidnapper," the headlines read. "The Bunker Killer's Reign of Terror." But for those of us who had worked the case, it felt like a hollow victory. Yes, we'd found the missing women, but only because Dale Hoffman had decided to end his life and confess his crimes. If he'd chosen to disappear instead, those women might have died slowly in their underground prisons. The psychological evaluations of the rescued women revealed the full scope of Hoffman's methodology. He'd been conducting what he called behavioral experiments, keeping detailed notes on how different women responded to captivity, isolation, and various forms of psychological manipulation. The women described a man who was methodical, intelligent, and completely without empathy. Rachel Morrison agreed to testify in the federal investigation, though Hoffman's death meant there would never be a trial. She told investigators that during her captivity, Hoffman had talked about his collection of women, describing them like specimens in a research project. He'd told her that she was special because she'd shown unusual resistance to psychological conditioning. But the case had one more twist that haunts me to this day. Among Hoffman's possessions, investigators found detailed surveillance notes on dozens of other women, potential victims he'd been watching but hadn't yet abducted. The notes included photographs, daily schedules, and personal information gathered through months of stalking. My name was in those notes, not as a target but as an obstacle. Hoffman had been watching me, studying my patrol routes, my schedule, my habits. He'd identified me as the most likely law enforcement officer to respond to reports of missing persons in my area, and he'd been planning accordingly. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before Rachel's abduction, read, "Officer Reynolds typically works solo on night shifts. Response time to remote locations averages 18 to 22 minutes. Methodical, but not particularly intuitive. Poses minimal threat to operations as long as standard precautions are maintained." He'd been playing a game with us, and we'd never even known we were players. Every move we'd made during the search for Rachel had been anticipated, planned for, and in some cases, guided by someone who'd been studying us as carefully as he'd studied his victims. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit concluded that Hoffman had been operating with this level of sophistication for his entire criminal career. He wasn't just a serial kidnapper. He was a predator who'd turned stalking law enforcement into part of his methodology. 6 months after Hoffman's death, I was contacted by a detective in Montana who was working a missing person case that sounded familiar. A young woman had vanished from a small town near Glacier National Park. Her car found abandoned with the engine running. The detective had read about the Clearwater County case and wanted to know if I thought there could be a connection. I looked at the crime scene photos he'd emailed, and my stomach dropped. The pattern was identical, too identical to be a coincidence. Either Hoffman had been operating in Montana before he came to Oregon, or someone else had read about his methods and decided to copy them. That's when I realized that Dale Marcus Hoffman's death might not have been the end of the story. It might have been just the end of the first chapter, because everything about his operation, the underground bunkers, the surveillance techniques, the methodical approach to victim selection, had been documented in detail by law enforcement and then reported extensively in the media. We'd accidentally created a blueprint for the perfect crime, and we'd published it for anyone with similar inclinations to read and study. The very investigation that had saved 9 women might have provided a template for future predators to follow. I've been tracking similar cases for the past 8 months, and the pattern is emerging again. 3 missing women in Montana, 2 in northern Idaho, 1 in rural Washington. All young, all disappeared under circumstances that match Hoffman's methodology almost exactly. The FBI has reopened the investigation as a potential copycat case, but resources are limited and the connections are still circumstantial. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, someone is building underground bunkers and studying the movements of local law enforcement officers. I think about this every time I respond to a missing person report now. I wonder if I'm being watched, if my response patterns are being noted and analyzed by someone who sees law enforcement as just another variable to account for in their planning. Last month, that wondering became something more concrete, something that keeps me awake at night with a kind of dread I've never experienced in 17 years of police work. I was finishing up paperwork at the station around 11 p.m. when dispatch called with a missing person report. The details were hauntingly familiar. A 24-year-old woman named Lisa Chen hadn't returned home from her job at a coffee shop in the next county over. Her car had been found abandoned on a rural road with the engine still running. I responded to the scene, following protocols I'd helped develop after the Hoffman case. But as I examined Lisa's car, I found something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a folded piece of paper. Written on it, in the same careful block letters I'd seen in Hoffman's confession, were the words, "Officer Reynolds, the game continues. Look harder this time." The handwriting analysis came back inconclusive. The paper was generic copy paper available at any office supply store. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence. But someone knew about my connection to the Hoffman case, knew enough about the details to reference looking harder, and had specifically addressed me by name. Lisa Chen was never found. Despite the largest search operation in the county's history, despite federal assistance and specialized equipment, she simply vanished without leaving any trace beyond that car and that note. But the note wasn't the only thing that suggested someone was continuing Hoffman's work. 3 days after Lisa's disappearance, I received a phone call at the station that I'll never forget. "Officer Reynolds." The voice was electronically distorted, probably run through a voice changer. "I wanted to thank you for your thorough documentation of Mr. Hoffman's methods. Your case reports were very educational." I tried to keep the caller on the line, tried to trace the call, but it lasted less than 30 seconds. The message was simple and terrifying. Someone had been studying our investigation of Hoffman, learning from our discoveries, and improving on his techniques. Over the next 6 months, 4 more women disappeared across 3 states. Each disappearance followed the Hoffman pattern exactly, but with refinements that suggested the perpetrator had learned from Hoffman's mistakes. No underground bunkers were ever found. No confessions were left behind. No evidence trails led anywhere. But I received a note after each disappearance, always left somewhere I would find it during my investigation. Always written in those same block letters, always containing just enough detail to let me know that whoever was doing this was watching my work, studying my methods, staying 1 step ahead. The FBI brought me in as a consultant on what they now call the Echo case, crimes that echo Hoffman's methodology, but with improvements that make them nearly impossible to solve. Agent Sarah Martinez, who heads the task force, told me something that I think about every day. "Reynolds, you need to understand something. Hoffman wasn't just a criminal. He was an innovator. And now his innovations are being replicated and improved upon by someone who might be even smarter than he was. The latest note I received was different from the others. Instead of being left at a crime scene, it was mailed to my home address, an address that's not publicly available, that would require significant effort to discover. The note contained a single sentence that has haunted me for the past month. When you're ready to play by the real rules, I'll be waiting in the place where it all began. The place where it all began. I know exactly what that means. Old Mill Road, where we first found Rachel Morrison's car, where this nightmare started for all of us. I haven't told Detective Chen about this latest note. I haven't told the FBI, because I know what whoever sent it wants. They want me to come alone, to confront them in the same location where we first encountered Hoffman's work. They want to turn me from an investigator into a participant in their game. But here's what terrifies me most. I'm actually considering it. Not because I think I can capture them. I'm not that naive. But because I know that as long as they're focused on me, as long as they see me as their primary opponent, they might not be taking more innocent women. Every night, I drive past Old Mill Road on my way home from work. I slow down at the spot where we found Rachel's car, and I look into those dark woods, wondering if someone is watching me from the tree line. Wondering if this is the night I'll finally see a signal, a sign that it's time for the game to move to its next phase. I've been carrying Hoffman's original confession in my patrol car, reading it over and over, looking for clues about this new predator's identity. But I think I've been approaching it wrong. The confession wasn't just Hoffman documenting his crimes. It was him passing on his knowledge to someone he knew would continue his work. In the margins of several pages, I've found pencil marks that weren't there when we first processed the confession. Someone else has been studying this document, annotating it, learning from it. Someone who had access to evidence that should have been securely stored in federal custody. That someone is playing a longer game than Hoffman ever did. They're not just taking women, they're building something. Each disappearance, each note, each interaction is designed to teach them more about law enforcement procedures, more about how we investigate, more about how to stay invisible. And I'm starting to realize that I might not be the hunter in this relationship. I might be the one being studied, being prepared for something I can't even imagine yet. Tomorrow night, I'm going to drive out to Old Mill Road. Not because I think I can end this, but because I think it's time to learn what they really want. Rachel Morrison survived her encounter with Dale Hoffman because she was stronger than he expected, because she refused to break under his psychological manipulation. Maybe it's time to find out if I'm strong enough to survive whatever comes next. But if something happens to me, if I don't come back from Old Mill Road tomorrow night, I want someone to know the truth about what we're really dealing with. This isn't just a copycat killer mimicking Hoffman's methods. This is someone who's been planning this for years. Someone who saw Hoffman's death not as an ending, but as an opportunity to perfect what he started. And they've been using me, using all of us, as unwitting teachers in their education. The real game was never about the women they took. It was about learning how to take them perfectly, how to make them disappear so completely that no evidence would ever be found, no families would ever have closure, no law enforcement would ever even know a crime had been committed. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in March 2022. Just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee and trying to convince myself that the stack of paperwork on my desk wasn't going to tackle itself. I'm Patricia Walsh, and I've been working missing persons for the Riverside County Sheriff's Department in California for the past 12 years. In that time, I've seen just about everything. Runaways, abductions, people who simply walked away from their lives and never looked back. but the case that came through that morning was different from anything I'd encountered before. "Walsh, we've got a missing child report," dispatch informed me. 8-year-old boy named Marcus Thompson disappeared from Willowbrook Elementary during recess yesterday afternoon. School didn't realize he was missing until the end of the day when his bus driver reported he never showed up for the ride home. I grabbed my jacket and keys, already feeling that familiar knot in my stomach that comes with child abduction cases. Kids don't just vanish from school playgrounds in broad daylight without someone noticing, and when they do, time is everything. The first 48 hours are critical in missing child cases, and we'd already lost almost 18 hours. Willowbrook Elementary sat in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood in Moreno Valley, the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their kids walk to school and play in the front yard until dark. It was a single-story brick building surrounded by chain-link fencing, with a large playground visible from the street. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see several patrol units already on scene, and a group of what appeared to be school staff huddled near the main entrance. Principal Janet Morrison met me at the front door. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and worry lines that looked like they'd been carved deeper overnight. "Detective Walsh, thank God you're here. I've been the principal at this school for 15 years and nothing like this has ever happened." She led me through the hallways toward her office, passing colorful bulletin boards covered with children's artwork and motivational posters. The building felt eerily quiet. Classes were in session, but I could sense the underlying tension that comes when something terrible disrupts the normal routine of a place meant to be safe. "Tell me exactly what happened yesterday," I said as we settled into her office. "Start from the beginning." Principal Morrison pulled out a manila folder thick with incident reports and notes. Yesterday was a normal day. Marcus arrived on the bus at 8:15 a.m., same as always. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, marked him present for first period, and he participated normally in all morning activities. At 12:30, the second and third grade classes went outside for recess. Who was supervising the playground? We had 3 staff members outside, Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Garcia from 3rd grade, and Mrs. Chen, our playground aide. Between the 3 of them, they were responsible for watching about 60 children. I made notes as she talked, already thinking about how easy it would be for one child to slip away unnoticed in that kind of chaos. When did they first realize Marcus was missing? That's just it. They didn't. When recess ended at 1 o'clock, all the children lined up by their teachers and went back inside. Mrs. Patterson did a head count and thought she had everyone. It wasn't until 3:15, when the buses were being loaded, that Marcus's bus driver, Mr. Rodriguez, asked where Marcus was. The timeline bothered me. Almost 3 hours had passed between when Marcus was last definitively seen and when anyone realized he was gone. That was a lot of time for someone to take a child and get a significant head start. "I need to speak with Mrs. Patterson and the other playground supervisors," I said. "But first, tell me about Marcus. Any family problems? Parents going through a divorce? Any custody issues?" Principal Morrison shook her head. "The Thompsons are a lovely family. Marcus lives with both parents, has a younger sister, no history of behavioral problems or family dysfunction. His father, David Thompson, works as an electrician, and his mother, Sarah, is a nurse at Riverside General. They're active in the PTA, always involved in school activities. Any adults who've shown unusual interest in Marcus? Volunteers, substitute teachers, maintenance workers? We've already gone through our volunteer database and employee records. Everyone who has access to the school has passed background checks, but..." She hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "But what?" Well, about 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she'd noticed a man sitting in a car across from the school during recess. She said he was there for maybe 15 minutes, just sitting and watching the playground. When she looked again, later, he was gone. My pulse quickened. Did she get a description of the man or the vehicle? She said it was a dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue. The man appeared to be middle-aged, but she couldn't see him clearly from the playground. She mentioned it to me, but we decided it was probably just a parent picking up another child, or maybe someone waiting for an appointment nearby. I asked Principal Morrison to have Mrs. Patterson meet me in the classroom while I examined the playground area. The school had security cameras, but they were primarily focused on the entrances and parking areas. The playground itself was only partially covered by the camera system. The playground was typical for an elementary school. Swing sets, slides, monkey bars, and a large open area for running games. What struck me immediately was how visible it was from the street. The chain-link fence provided some barrier, but anyone walking or driving by would have a clear view of the children playing. Mrs. Patterson joined me outside a few minutes later. She was a young teacher, probably in her late 20s, and I could see the guilt and self-blame written all over her face. Detective Walsh, I keep going over it in my mind, trying to remember if I saw anything unusual, if Marcus said anything that might give us a clue about where he went. Just tell me what you remember about recess yesterday. Take your time. It was a normal day. The kids went outside and scattered to their usual activities. Marcus typically plays on the monkey bars with a group of friends. I remember seeing him there early in the recess period, probably around 12:35 or 12:40. And when was the last time you specifically remember seeing him? Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes, concentrating. I think it was maybe 12:50, when I was breaking up a small argument between some girls near the swings. I looked over toward the monkey bars to check on that group, and I'm pretty sure I saw Marcus there. Pretty sure? Well, there were several children playing in that area, and from a distance they all looked similar. Same height, similar hair color. I saw a boy I thought was Marcus, but now I can't be certain it was actually him. That gave us a window. Marcus had disappeared sometime between 12:50 and 1 p.m. when the children lined up to go back inside. 10 minutes for someone to approach him, convince him to leave with them, and get away from the school. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to think carefully. During that 10-minute window, did you notice any adults near the fence? Any cars that slowed down or stopped on the street? Any distractions that might have drawn your attention away from the children? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her replaying the events in her mind. Actually, yes, there was something. Right around 12:55, one of the kindergarten classes came outside for their recess, and there was some confusion about which area of the playground they were supposed to use. Mr. Garcia and I both went over to help sort it out. We were probably focused on that situation for 3 or 4 minutes. 3 or 4 minutes of distraction. More than enough time for someone to approach Marcus and lead him away from the playground. I spent the next hour interviewing the other playground supervisors and several children who'd been playing near Marcus. The story that emerged was consistent but troubling. Marcus had been playing normally until near the end of recess, when several children remembered seeing him talking to someone near the fence that separated the playground from the street. 8-year-old Emma Chen provided the most detailed account. Marcus was on the monkey bars, and then this man called him over to the fence. The man was nice and smiled a lot. Marcus talked to him for a minute, and then they both walked away toward the parking lot. Did you recognize the man, Emma? No, but he seemed like he knew Marcus. Marcus wasn't scared or anything. He just went with him. This was the nightmare scenario every parent fears. A child abduction that happens so smoothly, so naturally, that witnesses don't even realize a crime is being committed. The perpetrator had clearly spent time observing the school, learning the routines, and identifying the perfect moment to approach Marcus. I called for additional units to begin canvassing the neighborhood around the school. If someone had taken Marcus on foot, there would be a limited radius of where they could have gone before being seen. If they'd used a vehicle, we needed to find witnesses who might have seen a man and child getting into a car. The Thompson family arrived at the school just as I was finishing my initial interviews. David Thompson was a tall, sturdy man with calloused hands and worry etched deep in his features. Sarah Thompson was petite and pale, with the kind of controlled composure that nurses develop in emergency situations, though I could see the panic barely contained beneath the surface. "Detective Walsh," David said, extending his hand. "Please tell me you're going to find our son." "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that we have every available resource working on this case, but I need to ask you some questions that might help us locate Marcus." We moved to a quiet classroom where I could speak with them privately. The questions I had to ask were difficult but necessary. Any recent changes in Marcus's behavior, any new people in their lives, any reason someone might target their family specifically. "Marcus is a friendly kid," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "Maybe too friendly. We've talked to him about stranger danger, but he's always been trusting, always assumes people are good. Has he mentioned meeting any new adults recently? Anyone who's shown particular interest in him?" David and Sarah exchanged glances. "Actually," David said slowly, "about a week ago, Marcus mentioned that a nice man had talked to him while he was playing in our front yard. The man asked him about school, about what grade he was in, that sort of thing." My stomach dropped. "Did Marcus describe this man?" "He said the man was driving a dark car and seemed very interested in hearing about Marcus's school and his schedule. We told Marcus he shouldn't talk to strangers, but he said the man was really nice and just seemed lonely. Did you see this man yourself?" "No, we were inside when it happened. Marcus told us about it at dinner that night. We talked to him again about not talking to strangers, but..." David's voice trailed off as the implications sank in. Someone had been grooming Marcus, building a relationship with him, gathering information about his routines and schedule. The conversation in the front yard had been reconnaissance. The man watching the school during recess had been final preparation. And yesterday, when the opportunity presented itself, he'd put his plan into action. "We need to consider the possibility that whoever took Marcus has been planning this for some time," I told the Thompsons. "That actually gives us some advantages in the investigation. People who plan crimes often leave more evidence behind because they have to make more contacts and take more risks during the preparation phase." But even as I said it, I could feel time slipping away. Every hour that passed reduced our chances of finding Marcus alive. Predators who go to this much trouble to abduct a specific child usually have plans that don't include returning them safely. The Amber Alert went out at 4:30 p.m., nearly 24 hours after Marcus had disappeared. His photo and description were broadcast across Southern California, along with the limited information we had about the suspect. A middle-aged man driving a dark sedan who had shown prior interest in the victim. By evening, we had a small army of volunteers helping to search the neighborhoods around Willowbrook Elementary. But I knew we were probably looking in the wrong place. Someone who had planned Marcus's abduction this carefully wouldn't keep him anywhere near the crime scene. As I sat in my car outside the school that night, watching the search teams with their flashlights moving through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. The level of planning, the patience to spend weeks gathering information, the precision of the timing. This wasn't someone acting on impulse or opportunity. This was someone who had done this before. The confirmation came at 6:47 a.m. the next morning, when I was jolted awake by my phone ringing. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep after staying at the command center until well past midnight, coordinating search efforts and following up on the dozens of tips that had come in after the Amber Alert. Detective Walsh, this is Agent Rebecca Martinez with the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit. I'm calling about the Marcus Thompson case. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. FBI involvement usually meant one of two things. Either the case had crossed state lines, or they had information connecting it to other crimes. Agent Martinez, what can you tell me? We've been monitoring your case since the Amber Alert went out yesterday. The method of abduction, the level of pre-planning, the victim profile. It matches a pattern we've been tracking across multiple states for the past 18 months. My blood ran cold. How many cases? 7 confirmed abductions with similar characteristics. All boys between the ages of 7 and 9, all taken from locations where the perpetrator would have had opportunities for extended surveillance. 3 of the victims were recovered alive, 2 were found deceased, and 2 remain missing. I was already getting dressed as she spoke, my mind racing through the implications. Where were the survivors found? Abandoned in remote locations between 48 and 72 hours after their abductions. All 3 reported being held in what they described as a clean room, a sterile environment with no windows, artificial lighting, and minimal furnishing. The perpetrator provided food and water, but had minimal direct contact with the victims. What about the deceased victims? Similar circumstances, but they showed signs of medical complications that weren't properly treated. The preliminary behavioral analysis suggests the perpetrator isn't primarily motivated by harming the children. He seems to be studying them, observing their behavior under controlled conditions. The clinical nature of what Agent Martinez was describing made my stomach turn. We weren't dealing with a typical child predator driven by obvious motivations. This was someone conducting what amounted to psychological experiments on kidnapped children. I'm driving to the command center now, I told her. How soon can you be here? I'm already en route from Los Angeles. I'll be at your location within 2 hours with a complete case file and a behavioral analyst from our unit. I arrived at the Willowbrook Elementary Command Center to find it buzzing with activity despite the early hour. The Thompson family had spent the night there, unable to bear the thought of going home while their son was missing. David Thompson was on the phone with relatives, organizing additional search volunteers, while Sarah sat at a table covered with maps, marking off areas that had already been searched. Detective Mike Rodriguez, my partner for the past 4 years, met me at the entrance with a cup of coffee and a grim expression. Walsh, we've got some developments overnight. 3 more witnesses came forward after seeing the news coverage. What did they see? A woman named Carol Jensen was walking her dog on Maple Street, about 4 blocks from the school, at approximately 1:15 yesterday afternoon. She saw a dark blue sedan driving slowly through the neighborhood with what appeared to be a man and a small boy inside. She didn't think much of it at the time, but the description matches. 4 blocks from the school, 15 minutes after Marcus had disappeared. The timeline fit perfectly. What about the other witnesses? Gas station attendant at the Shell station on Valley Boulevard about 2 miles east of here. Security camera footage shows a dark sedan pulling in around 1:30 p.m. yesterday. The driver got out to pump gas, but the angle doesn't give us a clear view of his face or the license plate. However, the attendant remembers seeing a child in the passenger seat who looked upset or scared. Please tell me we have the footage. Already secured. Tech unit is enhancing it now to see if we can get a better image of the driver or the vehicle identification. And the third witness? Rodriguez's expression darkened. This one's more concerning. A teacher at Roosevelt Middle School, about 15 miles north of here, reported seeing a man and child at a rest stop on Highway 60 around 3 p.m. yesterday. She noticed them because the child seemed distressed and kept looking around like he was searching for help. 15 miles north. If the timeline was accurate, Marcus's abductor was heading away from the urban areas, toward the more remote parts of Riverside County where abandoned buildings and isolated locations would be easier to find. Agent Martinez arrived exactly 2 hours after our phone call, accompanied by Dr. James Chen, a behavioral analyst who looked like he hadn't slept in days. They set up in the school's conference room with crime scene photos and case files that painted a terrifying picture of systematic child abduction. The perpetrator we're tracking appears to be a white male, probably between 35 and 50 years old, with above-average intelligence and significant planning capabilities, Dr. Chen explained as he arranged photos on the conference table. He selects victims based on specific criteria. Boys in a narrow age range, from stable family backgrounds with no history of behavioral problems. "What's he looking for?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Based on the surviving victims' accounts and the crime scene evidence, we believe he's conducting some form of psychological research. The clean rooms where he holds the children are designed to eliminate outside stimuli and create a controlled environment for observation." Agent Martinez pulled out a map marked with colored pins. "Here's what we know about his geographic pattern. The abductions have occurred across California, Nevada, and Arizona, but always in smaller communities or suburban areas where he can conduct surveillance without being noticed. The locations where victims have been recovered are typically 50 to 70 miles from the abduction sites." I studied the map, trying to identify any pattern that might help us predict where Marcus was being held. "The survivors. What did they tell you about their captor?" "Minimal direct contact," Dr. Chen replied. "He provided food and water through a slot in the door, spoke to them only when necessary, and always wore a mask or stayed out of their direct line of sight. He seemed most interested in observing how they reacted to isolation, how they spent their time when left alone, how they responded to various stimuli he would introduce into the environment." "What kind of stimuli?" "Toys, books, art supplies. He would provide different items and then remove them, apparently to study how the children adapted to changing circumstances. The clinical detachment of it was almost worse than more obvious forms of abuse. This person was treating kidnapped children like laboratory subjects, studying their psychological responses with the same objectivity a scientist might use to observe lab rats." "Agent Martinez, I need to know about the 2 children who didn't survive. What happened to them?" "Both appeared to have died from medical complications that could have been easily treated under normal circumstances. One had what appeared to be an asthma attack that wasn't properly managed. The other showed signs of dehydration and what might have been a diabetic episode." "So, he's not deliberately killing them?" "The evidence suggests that he's not equipped to handle medical emergencies, and he may not have sufficient knowledge about childhood health issues to recognize when a child needs immediate medical attention." This information gave me a glimmer of hope regarding Marcus. According to his medical records, he was a healthy child with no known chronic conditions. If the perpetrator's pattern held true, Marcus might survive the 72-hour observation period that seemed to be this person's standard time frame. But we still had to find him, and we were already approaching the 36-hour mark since his disappearance. The enhanced security footage from the gas station came back just after noon, and while it didn't give us a clear view of the driver's face, It did provide enough detail to identify the vehicle as a 2018 to 2020 Honda Accord with partial plate information. The tech analyst was able to determine that the license plate started with 8G and ended with either 47 or 87. Within hours, we had a list of 43 possible vehicles matching that description registered in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Each one would need to be tracked down and the owner interviewed, but it was the most concrete lead we'd had since the investigation began. While other detectives worked on running down the vehicle registrations, I decided to visit the locations where previous victims had been recovered. If the perpetrator was following his established pattern, Marcus would be released somewhere in the next 24 to 36 hours. The first location was an abandoned warehouse complex about 60 miles east of where a victim named Timothy Rodriguez had been abducted 8 months earlier. Timothy, now 9 years old, had been recovered here after being missing for 68 hours. He'd been found by hikers, sitting beside a water bottle and a small bag of food at the entrance to one of the empty buildings. As I walked through the warehouse complex, I tried to imagine what Timothy had experienced. According to the FBI reports, he'd described being kept in a small windowless room with white walls and bright fluorescent lighting. He'd been given regular meals, clean water, and various toys and books, but had no direct contact with his captor except for a voice speaking to him through an intercom system. The man asked me questions, Timothy had told investigators. Like what my favorite color was and what games I liked to play and what made me scared. But I never saw him, just heard his voice. The second location was even more remote. A cluster of abandoned mobile homes in the desert outside Barstow, where 7-year-old Angela Martinez had been found 3 months ago. Like Timothy, she'd been left with supplies and found by passing motorists who'd stopped to investigate. Both recovery sites shared certain characteristics. They were isolated enough that the perpetrator could leave a child without immediate risk of being seen, but accessible enough that the child would likely be found within a reasonable time frame. They were also positioned near regular travel routes, not main highways, but roads that local residents or commercial drivers might use regularly. As I drove back toward Riverside County, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something obvious. The perpetrator's pattern was too consistent, too predictable. Someone with his level of intelligence and planning ability wouldn't keep following the exact same procedures unless there was a specific reason, unless the pattern itself was part of the experiment. Dr. Chen's behavioral analysis had focused on what the perpetrator was studying about the children. But what if he was also studying law enforcement? What if our predictable responses to his crimes were as much a part of his research as the children's reactions to captivity? The thought was chilling, but it made sense. Each abduction, followed by a recovery at a predictable location, would teach him more about police procedures, response times, and investigation methods. He was learning about us while we thought we were learning about him. My phone rang as I pulled into the command center parking lot. Agent Martinez's name appeared on the caller ID. Walsh, we've got a break in the case. One of the Honda Accord registrations came back to a man named Dr. Richard Blackwood, age 42, with an address in Riverside County. He's a psychologist who was fired from UC Riverside 3 years ago for conducting unauthorized research involving human subjects. My pulse quickened. What kind of research? Studies on childhood stress responses and adaptation mechanisms. According to his former colleagues, he became obsessed with the idea that traditional research methods were too artificial to produce meaningful data about human behavior under genuine stress conditions. Where is he now? That's the problem. The address on file is a rental property that he vacated 6 months ago. The landlord says he left no forwarding address and paid his final month's rent in cash. We're trying to track down current information, but so far he's been very careful about staying off the grid. Dr. Richard Blackwood. Finally, we had a name and a motive that made sense of the clinical precision with which these crimes had been carried out. A psychologist conducting illegal human experimentation, using kidnapped children as unwilling test subjects. But knowing who we were looking for didn't tell us where Marcus was being held, and the 72-hour window was rapidly closing. Oh, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. At 2:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, nearly 40 hours after Marcus's disappearance, I received a call from Detective Rodriguez that pulled me from the restless sleep I'd managed to catch at my desk. "Walsh, get back to the command center immediately. We've got something big." I found the conference room buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Agent Martinez was on the phone with what sounded like federal database analysts, while Dr. Chen sat at a computer terminal scrolling through what appeared to be real estate records. "What's the situation?" I asked Rodriguez as I poured myself coffee from the pot that had been brewing continuously for the past 2 days. Remember how we couldn't find any current address information for Dr. Richard Blackwood? Well, it turns out he's been very clever about hiding his tracks, but not quite clever enough. Agent Martinez had the idea to search for property purchases or leases under variations of his name and professional credentials. Dr. Chen looked up from his computer screen. "We found 3 properties that were acquired in the past 18 months using shell companies that can be traced back to Blackwood through his professional license numbers and tax identification. One is a storage facility rental in Riverside, one is a small industrial property in Hemet, and one is a residential lease in the desert near Beaumont." My pulse quickened. All 3 locations were within the geographic area, where we'd expect to find Marcus based on the perpetrator's previous patterns. "Which one do we hit first?" Agent Martinez finished her phone call and joined our huddle around the map. "Based on the previous crime scenes and Dr. Chen's behavioral analysis, we think the industrial property in Hemed is our best bet. It's a small manufacturing building that's been vacant for 2 years. Isolated enough for privacy, but with vehicle access and utilities still connected." "What about the other 2 properties?" "We'll have teams standing by at both locations, but the storage facility would be too exposed for the kind of extended observation period Blackwood seems to require. And the residential lease is a mobile home in a community where neighbors would notice unusual activity." I checked my watch. It was now 2:47 a.m., approaching the 40-hour mark since Marcus had disappeared. If Blackwood was following his established pattern, we had the approximately 32 hours before he would release Marcus at some remote location, assuming Marcus survived whatever experiments Blackwood was conducting. "How long to organize the tactical response?" "SWAT is already mobilizing," Agent Martinez replied. "We'll have teams ready to move on all 3 locations within 90 minutes. But Walsh, I need you to understand something. Based on what the surviving victims have told us, Blackwood becomes extremely agitated if his routine is disrupted. If he realizes law enforcement has found him, there's no predicting how he might react." The implication was clear. Our rescue attempt might trigger exactly the kind of panicked response that had resulted in the deaths of the 2 children who hadn't survived their captivity. As we prepared for the coordinated raids, I found myself thinking about the Thompson family. David and Sarah had been maintaining a vigil at the command center, sustained by nothing but coffee, determination, and the slim hope that their son would be found alive. I hadn't had the heart to tell them about the 2 children who had died in Blackwood's custody. At 4:15 a.m., our convoy pulled out of the Willowbrook Elementary parking lot. I rode with Agent Martinez and Dr. Chen in an unmarked FBI vehicle, following the SWAT van toward the industrial property in Hemet. The pre-dawn darkness felt heavy with possibility and dread. The target building was a squat, concrete structure that had once housed a small electronics manufacturing operation. It sat at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned equipment. As we approached, I could see a dark Honda Accord parked behind the building, partially hidden by an industrial dumpster. "That's our vehicle," Agent Martinez confirmed over the radio. "License plate matches the partial from the gas station footage." The SWAT team moved into position with military precision, surrounding the building and establishing fields of fire that would prevent anyone from escaping. Dr. Chen and I took cover behind one of the response vehicles while Agent Martinez coordinated with the tactical commander. "We've identified 2 possible entry points," the SWAT leader reported. "Main entrance in front and a service door on the east side. Thermal imaging shows at least 1 heat signature inside the building, possibly 2, but the concrete construction is limiting our visibility." 2 heat signatures. My heart pounded as I realized one of them was likely Marcus, hopefully still alive after almost 2 days in captivity. "Remember," Dr. Chen said over the radio, "Blackwood's psychological profile suggests he'll try to maintain control of the situation even under extreme stress. He may attempt to use the child as leverage, or may become so focused on completing his research that he ignores our presence entirely." The order to move came at 4:32 a.m. I watched through night vision binoculars as the SWAT team breached both entrances simultaneously, their movements swift and coordinated. Shouted commands echoed from inside the building. "Police, get down, show me your hands." The silence that followed seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds. Then Agent Martinez's radio crackled with the voice of the tactical commander. "Suspect in custody. We have 1 adult male, matches the description of Dr. Richard Blackwood. He was attempting to destroy documents when we entered. What about the child?" I called into the radio. A pause that made my stomach clench. Then, "We have a juvenile victim. Appears to be alive, but in need of immediate medical attention. Requesting ambulance to our location." I was running toward the building before anyone could stop me, my training as a detective warring with my instincts as someone who had spent the past 2 days searching for this missing child. Agent Martinez caught up with me at the entrance to the building. Inside, I found a scene that would haunt me for the rest of my career. The building had been converted into what could only be described as a laboratory, with multiple small rooms separated by recently constructed walls. Video cameras were mounted in every corner, and banks of monitors showed feeds from what appeared to be several different observation chambers. In the largest room, I found Marcus Thompson. He was sitting on a small cot, alive but clearly traumatized. He looked smaller than his 8 years, thin and pale, wearing the same clothes he'd been dressed in when he disappeared from school 2 days earlier. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he didn't respond when I called his name. "Marcus, my name is Detective Walsh. I'm here to take you home to your mom and dad." He looked at me without recognition, as if he was having trouble processing what was happening. The paramedics arrived within minutes and began checking his vital signs while I tried to assess his emotional state. "Has he said anything?" I asked one of the SWAT officers who had been first into the room. "Nothing coherent. He seems to be in some kind of shock, but physically he appears to be unharmed." As the paramedics prepared to transport Marcus to the hospital, I took a closer look at the setup Blackwood had created. Each observation room was equipped with hidden cameras, one-way mirrors, and what appeared to be speakers for delivering audio stimuli. The level of sophistication was far beyond what I had imagined based on the FBI's previous descriptions. Dr. Chen was examining a stack of documents that Blackwood had been trying to destroy when the SWAT team breached the building. "Walsh, you need to see this," he called from across the room. The papers were research notes, written in Blackwood's careful handwriting, documenting every aspect of Marcus's captivity. Hour-by-hour observations of his behavior, detailed notes about his responses to different stimuli, even measurements of his stress indicators based on analysis of the video feeds. But what made my blood run cold was the final entry, dated just hours before our raid. Subject shows signs of psychological adaptation to controlled environment. Recommend extending observation period to 120 hours to document long-term behavioral modifications. Previous 72-hour limit may be insufficient for meaningful data collection. Blackwood had been planning to keep Marcus for 5 days, not 3. If we hadn't found him when we did, Marcus would have been held for another 48 hours in that sterile, windowless room. Dr. Richard Blackwood himself was a thin, unremarkable man in his early 40s who looked more like an accountant than a child predator. When I saw him being loaded into the FBI transport vehicle, he was demanding to speak with his attorney and insisting that his research was vital to understanding childhood psychological resilience. Even in custody, he showed no remorse for what he had done to Marcus or the other children. To him, they were nothing more than test subjects in an experiment he considered more important than their safety or well-being. At the hospital, I watched through the observation window as doctors examined Marcus while his parents held his hands and whispered reassurances. Physically, he was in remarkably good condition. Well-fed, hydrated, and showing no signs of physical abuse. But the psychological impact was clearly significant. "He keeps asking when the tests are going to start," Sarah Thompson told me, tears streaming down her face. "He thinks this is part of whatever that monster was doing to him." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatric psychiatrist assigned to Marcus's case, explained that children who survive this type of trauma often struggle to readjust to normal environments after being held in the artificial conditions Blackwood created. "He's been conditioned to expect constant observation and to respond to external stimuli in very specific ways," she said. "It's going to take time and careful therapy to help him understand that he's safe and that the rules he learned in captivity don't apply to the real world." Over the following days, as Marcus began the long process of psychological recovery, we learned more about the scope of Blackwood's operation. The industrial building in Hemet was just one of several facilities he had used over the past 2 years. Searches of the storage unit and mobile home revealed additional evidence of his crimes, including video recordings of some of the earlier abductions and detailed research files on each of his victims. The FBI's investigation eventually connected Blackwood to 11 child abductions across 4 states, making him one of the most prolific serial child abductors in recent history. But unlike most criminals of his type, his motivation had never been sexual gratification or ransom money. It had been the pursuit of psychological research that he believed would revolutionize the understanding of childhood trauma and resilience. During his interrogation, Blackwood showed no remorse for the suffering he had caused. He insisted that his research was groundbreaking, and that the temporary trauma to his subjects was justified by the potential benefits to scientific understanding. "These children have contributed to knowledge that could help millions of other children in the future," he told investigators. "The temporary discomfort they experienced is a small price to pay for advancing human understanding of psychological adaptation mechanisms." The complete lack of empathy in his statements made it clear that Blackwood would never understand the true cost of his crimes. To him, Marcus Thompson and the other children were nothing more than lab rats in an experiment that he considered more important than their humanity. But as I sat in the hospital watching Marcus slowly begin to respond to his parents' voices, I knew that the real measure of our success wouldn't be found in Blackwood's conviction or sentencing. It would be found in Marcus's recovery, in his ability to trust again, and in his eventual return to the normal childhood that Blackwood had stolen from him. The case was closed, but the consequences would last for years to come. 3 months after Marcus Thompson's rescue, I found myself sitting in my car outside Willowbrook Elementary, watching children play during recess, and thinking about how fundamentally the Blackwood case had changed my perspective on missing persons investigations. The playground looked exactly the same as it had the day Marcus disappeared, but I knew I would never look at it the same way again. Marcus had returned to school just 2 weeks earlier, after extensive therapy and gradual reintegration sessions designed to help him readjust to normal social environments. According to his parents, he was making progress, but the changes in him were unmistakable. The trusting, outgoing child who had talked to a stranger in his front yard had been replaced by someone who was cautious, hypervigilant, and quick to withdraw when faced with unfamiliar situations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had warned us that this would likely be a permanent change. Children who survive this type of systematic psychological manipulation often develop what we call adaptive hypervigilance, she explained during one of our follow-up meetings. It's a survival mechanism that helped him cope with captivity, but it can make normal childhood experiences feel threatening or overwhelming. The ripple effects extended far beyond Marcus himself. The other families affected by Blackwood's crimes were dealing with similar challenges as their children worked to recover from their ordeals. Some of the younger victims seemed to be adapting more quickly, but the older children, particularly those who had been held for the full 72-hour periods, were struggling with long-term psychological effects. 8-year-old Timothy Rodriguez, who had been abducted 8 months before Marcus, was still having nightmares about being watched through cameras. 7-year-old Angela Martinez had developed severe separation anxiety and refused to let her parents leave her sight for more than a few minutes. These weren't temporary reactions that would fade with time. They were fundamental changes in how these children experience the world. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came during the extensive forensic analysis of Blackwood's research materials. Hidden among his files, investigators found detailed psychological profiles of law enforcement officers who had worked his previous cases, including response time analyses, behavioral predictions, and what appeared to be countermeasures designed to exploit weaknesses in standard missing persons protocols. Agent Martinez showed me some of these files during our final case review meeting. Walsh, you need to understand what we're really dealing with here. Blackwood wasn't just studying the children he abducted, he was studying us. Every investigation, every search pattern, every decision we made was being analyzed and incorporated into his planning for future crimes. The implications were chilling. Blackwood had essentially been conducting 2 parallel experiments, one on the psychological responses of kidnapped children, and another on the behavioral patterns of law enforcement agencies investigating child abductions. "Look at this," Agent Martinez said, pointing to a detailed timeline in Blackwood's handwriting. He documented the exact time it took us to identify him as a suspect in each case, how long it took to locate his facilities, even predictions about which investigative techniques would be most effective against his methods. I studied the documents with growing unease. Blackwood had been several steps ahead of us throughout the entire investigation, not just because of his intelligence and planning abilities, but because he had been systematically studying how we worked. Our own procedures and protocols had become part of his research data. Agent Martinez, are you telling me that Blackwood allowed us to catch him? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Look at the final entries in his research log. He was documenting what he called law enforcement adaptation patterns right up until the moment we breached his facility. He knew we were closing in, and he was using our investigation as the final phase of his research. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Our rescue of Marcus hadn't been the successful conclusion of a difficult investigation. It had been the planned endpoint of Blackwood's experiment. He had gathered all the data he needed about both his child subjects and law enforcement responses, and he had allowed himself to be captured because he considered his research complete. This meant that somewhere in his seized materials were detailed instructions for conducting similar experiments, along with comprehensive analysis of how to avoid the mistakes that had led to his capture. The FBI had classified most of these materials, but the knowledge existed, and it could potentially be replicated by someone with similar inclinations and resources. Dr. Chen confirmed my worst fears during our final consultation. Blackwood's research methodology was sophisticated enough to be published in academic journals if the subject matter weren't so horrific. He's created what amounts to a handbook for systematic child abduction and psychological manipulation, complete with countermeasures against law enforcement intervention. The sentencing hearing took place 6 months after Marcus's rescue. Blackwood received 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each confirmed victim. But as I sat in the courtroom listening to impact statements from the families he had destroyed, I couldn't shake the feeling that justice was incomplete. Marcus's father, David Thompson, delivered a statement that captured what many of us were feeling. Dr. Blackwood stole more than just our children's sense of safety. He stole their innocence, their ability to trust, their natural curiosity about the world. These are losses that can never be fully repaired, no matter how many years he spends in prison. Sarah Thompson was even more direct in her condemnation. He treated our children like laboratory animals, and he shows no remorse for the suffering he caused. The only thing he regrets is getting caught before he could continue his sick experiments. Throughout the hearing, Blackwood remained emotionally detached, occasionally taking notes as if the proceedings were simply another source of research data. When given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, he declined, saying only that he hoped his research would someday be properly evaluated by qualified professionals who could appreciate its scientific merit. Even in defeat, even facing life in prison, he remained convinced that his crimes had been justified by their research value. But the story didn't end with Blackwood's sentencing. 2 months later, I received a call from Detective Sarah Chen in Phoenix, Arizona. She was investigating the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy named Kevin Walsh, who had vanished from a shopping mall during a family outing. Detective Walsh, I know this might sound strange, but the circumstances of Kevin's disappearance are remarkably similar to the pattern you documented in the Blackwood case. The level of planning, the precision of the timing, even the victim profile, it's almost identical. My blood ran cold as she described the details. Kevin had been separated from his family for less than 10 minutes in a crowded mall, but surveillance footage showed him leaving willingly with an unidentified adult male. The man had approached Kevin while his parents were distracted, engaged him in what appeared to be friendly conversation, and then simply walked away with him through a side exit. Detective Chen, have you found any evidence of prior surveillance or contact between the suspect and the victim? That's the thing that really concerns me. Kevin's mother mentioned that, about 2 weeks ago, Kevin told her about a nice man who had talked to him at the park near their house. The man had asked questions about Kevin's school, his family, his daily routine. It's exactly the same grooming pattern Blackwood used. 3 days later, Detective Rodriguez called with similar news from San Diego. A 7-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez had disappeared from a school playground during recess, last seen talking to an unknown adult male near the fence separating the playground from the street. Within a week, I was coordinating with law enforcement agencies across 5 states, tracking what appeared to be a new series of child abductions, following Blackwood's exact methodology. The victims were all within the same age range, from stable family backgrounds and taken after periods of apparent grooming and surveillance. But this new perpetrator was different from Blackwood in one crucial way. He was learning from Blackwood's mistakes. Where Blackwood had maintained consistent patterns that eventually allowed us to predict his behavior, this new abductor was introducing variations that made him much harder to track. The FBI reopened the investigation as a potential copycat case, but Agent Martinez admitted privately that they were dealing with someone who might be even more dangerous than Blackwood had been. Whoever this is has access to Blackwood's research materials and methodology, but they're also adapting and improving on his techniques. She told me during a conference call with investigators from multiple jurisdictions. They're using his playbook, but they're not making his mistakes. As I write this, 6 children have disappeared across 4 states in circumstances that mirror Blackwood's crimes with disturbing precision. None of them have been recovered. No facilities have been found, no suspects have been identified. The most terrifying possibility is that Blackwood's research has fallen into the hands of someone who views his capture not as a failure, but as a valuable learning experience. Someone who has studied every aspect of our investigation and developed countermeasures for each technique we use to find him. But there's another possibility that keeps me awake at night. What if Blackwood's imprisonment wasn't the end of his research program? What if he had partners or followers who are now carrying on his work, using the detailed methodologies he developed to conduct their own experiments on kidnapped children? I think about Marcus Thompson often, watching him struggle to rebuild his sense of safety and trust in a world that betrayed him so completely. I think about the other survivors, each dealing with their own lasting trauma from their encounters with a man who saw them as nothing more than test subjects. And I think about the children who are missing now, possibly being held in facilities even more sophisticated than the ones we found, by someone who has learned from every mistake Blackwood made. The case that I thought we had closed may have been just the beginning of something much worse. Somewhere out there, children are disappearing into a nightmare that we helped create by documenting Blackwood's methods so thoroughly. The question that haunts me is simple. How do you catch someone who has studied every technique you know how to use? The answer came in the most unexpected way possible. Exactly 1 year after Marcus Thompson's rescue, I was at my desk, reviewing cold case files and trying to identify any patterns that might connect to the ongoing copycat investigations, when my phone rang with a call that would change everything I thought I knew about the Blackwood case. Detective Walsh, this is Dr. Rebecca Martinez at the California State Prison in Lancaster. I'm the chief psychiatrist here, and I need to speak with you urgently about Dr. Richard Blackwood. My stomach tightened. Blackwood had been held in maximum security since his conviction, with extremely limited contact with the outside world. Any news about him was unlikely to be good. What's happened, Dr. Martinez? Blackwood has been requesting to speak with you specifically for the past 3 months. We've been denying these requests per standard protocol. But yesterday he provided information that suggests he may have crucial details about the recent child disappearances that have been attributed to a copycat perpetrator. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of information? He claims to know the identity of the person who's been conducting the new abductions. He says he's been in communication with this individual and has been providing guidance on improving his methodology. The words hit me like a physical blow. Despite being in maximum security prison, Blackwood had somehow been continuing his research through a proxy. The new abductions weren't copycat crimes. They were a continuation of his original experiment, orchestrated from behind bars. Dr. Martinez, how is that possible? Blackwood's communications are supposed to be completely monitored. That's what we need to discuss. Can you be here this afternoon? I think you need to hear what Blackwood has to say directly. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a sterile interview room at California State Prison, waiting for my first face-to-face encounter with Dr. Richard Blackwood since his arrest. When the guards brought him in, I was struck by how little he had changed. He looked exactly the same as he had during his trial, thin, unremarkable, with the same cold intelligence in his eyes that had made him so dangerous. "Detective Walsh," he said as he settled into the chair across from me, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist. "Thank you for coming. I assume Dr. Martinez has briefed you on why I requested this meeting. She said you have information about the recent child disappearances. Start talking." Blackwood smiled, an expression that held no warmth or humanity. "Before I share what I know, I want you to understand something important. My research was never intended to end with my incarceration. In fact, my imprisonment has provided me with a unique opportunity to study law enforcement behavior from an entirely new perspective. Get to the point, Blackwood. The person you're looking for is someone I've been mentoring through our legal correspondence. His name is Dr. Michael Chen, and he was a graduate student in my program at UC Riverside before my termination. He's been carrying on my work, but with significant improvements to the methodology. Dr. Michael Chen. I made note of the name while trying to process the implications of what Blackwood was telling me. He had been conducting his research from prison, using a former student as his proxy in the field. How have you been communicating with Dr. Chen? Through perfectly legal channels, Detective Walsh. Academic correspondence between a professor and his former student, discussing theoretical research methodologies. Every letter has been reviewed by prison authorities and found to contain nothing that violates regulations." The casual way he described, orchestrating child abductions as academic correspondence, made my skin crawl. But I needed more information if we were going to stop Dr. Chen before he took more children. Where is Dr. Chen conducting these experiments? Ah, Detective Walsh, that's where this becomes interesting. Dr. Chen has learned from my mistakes. Instead of using fixed locations that could be discovered through investigation, he's developed a mobile methodology. The children are held in specially equipped recreational vehicles that can be moved constantly to avoid detection. Mobile facilities. It explained why we hadn't been able to locate any of the missing children, despite extensive searches of potential hiding places. Dr. Chen was keeping them in vehicles that could be moved whenever law enforcement got close. Blackwood, 6 children are missing. Where's Dr. Chen now? I'm afraid I don't have that specific information. Our correspondence focuses on methodology and research design, not operational details. But I can tell you that, Doctor. Chen has made significant improvements to my original protocols. What kind of improvements? Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with what appeared to be professional pride. Longer observation periods, more sophisticated monitoring equipment, and most importantly, better security measures to prevent the subjects from escaping or communicating with the outside world. The casual way he referred to kidnapped children as subjects reinforced everything I had learned about his complete lack of empathy. But the information about longer observation periods was crucial. It meant the missing children might still be alive, even though some had been gone for weeks. How long are these observation periods? Dr. Chen's research design calls for a minimum of 2 weeks of controlled observation, with extensions possible depending on the subject's adaptation responses. It's far more comprehensive than my original 72-hour protocol. 2 weeks. Some of the missing children had been gone for nearly a month, which meant Dr. Chen might be conducting even longer experiments than Blackwood had originally designed. Blackwood, why are you telling me this? What do you want in return? I want recognition for my research contributions, Detective Walsh. Dr. Chen's work is built on my theoretical foundations, and when he publishes his findings, I want to ensure that my role in developing the methodology is properly acknowledged. The complete absence of concern for the children's welfare in his motivation was staggering. Even from prison, facing multiple life sentences, Blackwood was still primarily concerned with receiving academic credit for his crimes. You're talking about kidnapped children, not research subjects. These are real people whose lives have been destroyed by your sick experiments. Detective Walsh, I understand that you're emotionally invested in these cases, but emotion has no place in scientific inquiry. The data Dr. Chen is collecting will advance our understanding of childhood psychological resilience in ways that could benefit millions of children in the future. I wanted to reach across the table and shake him until he showed some recognition of the human cost of his research, but I knew that would be futile. Blackwood was incapable of viewing his victims as anything other than laboratory specimens. Give me something concrete I can use to find Dr. Chen. Vehicle descriptions, license plates, areas where he might be operating. I can tell you that Dr. Chen has been focusing his research on smaller communities in rural areas, places where law enforcement resources are limited and response times are longer. He's also shown preference for targeting children from families with limited financial resources, as they tend to generate less media attention when they disappear. The clinical precision with which he described victim selection criteria made me feel sick. But it was also useful information that might help us predict where Dr. Chen would strike next. Is there anything else? Any other details that might help us locate the missing children? Blackwood was quiet for a moment, apparently considering how much information to share. Detective Walsh, I want you to understand that Dr. Chen is significantly more intelligent and better prepared than I was when I conducted my original research. He's learned from every mistake I made, and he's developed countermeasures for every investigative technique you used to capture me. Meaning, what exactly? Meaning that traditional law enforcement methods are unlikely to be successful against him. Dr. Chen has been studying your investigation of my case as carefully as I studied your investigative techniques. He knows how you think, how you work, how you prioritize different types of evidence. The implication was clear. Dr. Chen had turned our own success against Blackwood into a roadmap for avoiding capture. Every technique we had used, every breakthrough that had led us to Blackwood's facilities had been analyzed and countered. Then, how do we catch him? Blackwood smiled again, that same cold expression that held no trace of human warmth. That, Detective Walsh, is not my problem to solve. My role was to develop the theoretical framework for this research. Implementation and operational security are Dr. Chen's responsibilities. As I prepared to leave the prison, Blackwood made one final statement that would haunt me for months to come. Detective Walsh, I want you to know that regardless of whether Dr. Chen is captured or continues his work, my research will live on. There are others who have been studying our methodology, others who understand the scientific value of what we've accomplished. This is bigger than just one or two researchers. The drive back to Riverside County gave me time to process what I had learned. Dr. Michael Chen was conducting mobile experiments on kidnapped children using improved versions of Blackwood's methodology, and he had been preparing for law enforcement intervention by studying our previous investigation techniques. But more disturbing was Blackwood's implication that there were other researchers involved, other people who had been studying his methods and preparing to continue his work. We weren't just dealing with one copycat perpetrator. We were potentially facing a network of individuals who viewed child abduction as a legitimate research methodology. Within hours of my return, I was coordinating with FBI agents and local law enforcement across multiple states, sharing everything I had learned from Blackwood and organizing a manhunt for Dr. Michael Chen. But as we began the search, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The Chen had anticipated this development and taken countermeasures to stay ahead of us. Somewhere out there, 6 children were being held in mobile laboratories by someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of investigation. And somewhere else, other researchers were studying our methods and preparing to take over if Dr. Chen was captured. The question was no longer how to catch someone who had studied our techniques. The question was how to stop a network of predators who had turned child abduction into an academic discipline, complete with research protocols, peer review, and methodological improvements. I switched off the cruiser's engine but left the radio crackling on guard. My breath came in clouds that drifted into the hollow silence of the forest edge, where the trees rose like silent sentinels against the moonlit sky. I hauled my flashlight from the console and checked its beam before stepping onto the mud-slick gravel shoulder of Highway 22. The call had been a 911 hang-up. No voice at all, just a click and then dead silence. Caller ID traced to a cell phone registered to my father's old number, one I'd kept on file since he'd passed 2 years ago. I didn't believe in ghosts, but in that instant I felt every shadow around me grow teeth. I trudged along the logging road that branched off eastward. Tires long since gone, leaving only ruts and pools of standing water that reflected the stars in jagged shards. Each step echoed against my boots like a verdict. There was something out here, something wrong, and I was the only one foolish enough to chase it. My left hand hovered over my service revolver, the cold steel a familiar comfort beneath my leather coat. The rest of me ached, from the long shift behind the wheel, from last night's restless dreams. But adrenaline kept my muscles coiled, ready. After 100 yards, I found the sedan. It sat half-submerged in a ditch carved along the road's edge, door handles glinting under my beam. The rear bumper bore streaks of mud, as if someone had tried to drag it backward before giving up. I knelt at the rear window and pressed my palm against the cold glass. Frost had begun to form around the edges, though the engine had only been cold for minutes. Inside, the front seats were empty, but a woolen cap lay on the passenger floorboard, its knitted pattern frayed. I snapped a photo with my phone, then paused at the radio. "Dispatch, it's Mitchell. I need K9 and backup at mile marker 41. There's an unoccupied vehicle with a warm cap inside." Static crackled, then the dispatcher. "Copy that, Unit 14. ETA 5 minutes. The stupidity of waiting made me grit my teeth, but procedure was procedure. I circled the car, shining my light into the darkness beyond the tree line, where the forest pressed in so close I could almost hear it breathing. The beam caught something faint, footprints, clear as day, leading away from the driver's door and into the underbrush. I stood and followed them. Each footfall crushed fallen needles until I reached a small clearing. Here, the tracks vanished. No broken twigs, no scuffed earth, just an impossible absence, like someone had stepped out of the world itself. My stomach twisted. I fumbled for the radio again. "Dispatch, footprints lead into the timber, but..." My words cut off as a low rumble echoed through the trees. Heart thudding, I shone the light uphill. There, half buried beneath a fallen log, lay a man's ankle, sock slashed and dirty. I knelt, swept leaves aside, revealing more: the torn edge of a jacket collar, a sleeve stained dark. I pressed my gloved fingers against the fabric. It was damp with something that didn't belong to the morning dew. I swallowed hard, stepping back so quickly I stumbled over a root. "Hello?" I called. My voice sounded wrong, too loud.
too brittle. The forest swallowed it. My breath came ragged. I clicked the radio mic. "Dispatch, I found evidence of a body, possible assault. Request immediate medical and homicide." Before I could finish, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it, but it buzzed again, insistent. Finally, I pulled it out. Caller ID. "Mom." I stared at the name, blood draining from my face. My mother died. But I'd told dispatch my father's number, not hers. Something buried deeper in my memory, names, dates, wrenched itself free in that moment. I hit answer. "Mitchell?" My sister's voice, shaky. Did you get my text? It's Dad. He never came home." The evening before, she'd texted me frantic. Their farmhouse phone line went dead at 9, and then his cell pinged off last location near mile marker 41. I went cold to the bone. "He called 911? My words were a rasp. "Only, you answered the car," she breathed. "I found his cap on the porch. It's the same kind you and Dad wore when you were tracking elk." I shut my eyes, hands trembling around the phone. "Stay inside," I managed. "Lock the door. I'm coming." I ended the call, zipped the phone into my jacket, and looked back toward the ditch. The wrecked sedan lay half hidden under the blazing moonlight, but now something moved inside. I raised my flashlight and shone it through the windshield. A shape hunched over the passenger seat, head bowed. My finger snapped a photo, and the thing jerked upright, flinging something metallic that skittered across the glass and clanged inside. I wrestled the door handle. Locked. Heart hammering, I circled to the driver's side, yanked the door open. The interior was saturated in a quiet dread. No one sat behind the wheel. Scattered across both seats were belongings that didn't belong to my father. An expensive camera bag, a half-empty water bottle with pink lipstick smeared inside the cap, and a GPS unit still blinking its last coordinates. I flicked it on. Latitude, longitude, then lost signal. No memory of these items. But my gaze fell on the windshield. Written in the condensation where the defroster hadn't reached was a single word. Home. The letters were smeared, as if traced by stubby fingers. A chill sank through my chest. I backed away, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the trees that seemed to lean closer, straining to listen. I should have called for backup. I should have retreated. Instead, I climbed back in, started the engine, and nosed the car forward until my headlights hit the logging road again. There, half a mile deep, the headlights caught two figures standing side by side, a man and a woman, silhouettes motionless, staring back at me. The radio's static grew louder, and for a moment I thought I heard them whisper, "Come home." My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I swallowed, trying to fight the tremor in my voice as I keyed the mic. "Dispatch. I'm moving to intercept persons on foot at..." But the forest exploded in a gut-shaking roar as the figures vanished, leaving only the hiss of leaves and the pounding of my own heart. I switched off the rig in the middle of the road, yanked open my door, and stepped into the cold that felt like knives against my skin. I flicked my light to the left. Nothing. To the right, nothing but mist. Then, from somewhere down the road, a single shot rang out. The echo rattled my bones. I froze, hands clenched on the flashlight. It was Dad's revolver. No, that couldn't be. My breath steamed in the air as the forest held its breath, too, waiting for me to decide. Run back to the safety of my radio, or step forward into every fear I'd ever had to find my father's voice in the dark. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the trees, boots crunching needles and splintering small branches underfoot, as the engine's dying growl faded behind me. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the gloom, only enough to show the closest trunks and the low-hanging boughs loaded with moisture. The shot had come from down the road, maybe 100 yards away, but in the forest it sounded like it was right beside me. My pulse slammed against my ribs as I wove between the pines, each beam of light revealing a new patch of darkness beyond, as if the woods were breathing and shifting to keep me off balance. I reached a clearing that opened onto the highway shoulder, but the rig was gone. No cruiser lights, no amber strobes, nothing but the fog drifting over shredded gravel. My radio lay abandoned behind an overturned branch. The mic still crackled with static. I scooped it up, pressed the PTT key, but only silence answered. I pressed again, harder. "Dispatch! Dispatch, do you copy?" My voice tore through the night, but all I heard was the echo of my own desperation. I yanked the handgun from my holster, the weight familiar and terrible in my hand, and pointed the flashlight down the road. Highway 22 stretched away like a pale ribbon. At its edge stood a second sedan, headlights scoured out as if someone had hastily masked them with cloth. The passenger door hung open, glass shattered across the hood. I approached slowly, weapon raised, light dancing across crumpled metal. Inside lay a wallet, driver's license face up. My father's name, George Mitchell, Sweetwater County badge number. His photo stared at me, mustachioed, square-jawed, the proud look of a man who'd kept every citizen safe for 35 years. I swallowed hard, knuckles whitening on the grip. Beneath the badge was a single blood smear across the leather cover. My father wasn't dead, but he wasn't unharmed either. I grabbed at the wallet, but a sudden crack of twigs behind me spun me around. My light found nothing but the gloom. I stepped back, foot catching on a root. Pain shot up my shin, but I wouldn't let it slow me. I trained my beam on the scraggly embankment. Tire tracks led from the highway back toward the timber, narrow and fresh. I followed them. Each step sank slightly in damp earth, until the wheel marks ended at a stand of alders. There, the ground under them was churned, as if someone had dragged a heavy object through the mud and left a scar. I knelt, finger trailing along the deepest rut. It was too small for a full-grown man's bulk, like it belonged to a lightweight ATV or jackknifed trailer. But Dad didn't own such a thing. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, an unknown number. I resisted the urge to answer. Answers were what got people hurt. The static in my radio grew louder, then a faint voice crackled through, clipped and distant. "Mitchell? Mitchell? Can you hear me?" I hit the PTT. "Yes. Who is this?" The line went dead. I checked the channel, back to static. I flicked through presets, but every frequency had only hiss. Whoever wanted me to hear them wasn't using a standard channel. I heard movement to my left, a soft rustle of leaves. I dialed back the flashlight, narrowing its cone to a tight beam that I swung over the brush. Shape. A hunched figure, clad in an oilskin jacket, stepping from behind a tree. The beam caught their face. My father's, gray-stubbled and haunted, eyes wide with something between relief and warning. I exhaled, the tension briefly easing, until he raised a shaking hand. A revolver glinted in the moonlight. "Don't move," he rasped. His voice was raw, unfamiliar. "Get down!" I knelt to show I meant no harm. "Dad, what the hell happened?" My heart pounded like a war drum, but my voice stayed calm, professional. He looked down, shame flickering across his features. "They had me," he said, voice low. "After you left, I tried to follow you, but they..." He swallowed, eyes darting to the tree line. "They caught me, took me deeper." I reached out, but he recoiled, finger twitching on the trigger. "They're watching us," he hissed. "They know we're here." Then his gaze sharpened. "You shouldn't have come." I pressed my lips together. "I had to find you." I stood slowly, keeping my hands visible. "Who took you, Dad? What do they want?" He shook his head, stepping back until my flashlight beam illuminated the ground at his feet. Another carving in the wet soil. 2 letters, GM, our shared initials. Fresh and bleeding earth over the scratches. My head spun. "They're marking us," I breathed. He yanked my sleeve. "Listen to me. If they see your badge, your uniform, they'll kill us both. You have to leave." His hand shook so violently the revolver barrel danced. "Go. Get back to your cruiser. Call for help." I hesitated. The radio was useless, the highway shoulder abandoned. "I can't leave you," I said. He pressed a finger to my lips. "You can, and you will. You're already dead if you stay." He glared at me, desperate. "You have to go now." I looked at the crushed wheel tracks leading back, then at the trees beyond. Something crashed behind me. Both of us spun. 3 figures lunged forward, tall, thin, clad in hooded coats that swallowed their forms. Their faces were obscured by shadow. The closest reached out, long fingers brushing the air a foot from my chest. I recoiled, heart leaping. My father fired twice, sharp cracks in the night. One figure jerked, caught something in its shoulder, but the bullet seemed to pass through without slowing. The shapes advanced, silent except for the soft thud of boots on dirt. I raised my own revolver, hands shaking so badly the beam jittered. My mind raced. Backup was minutes away, but those minutes stretched like hours when your life depended on them. I found my voice. "Keep moving." I grabbed my father's arm, pulling him forward as the creatures closed in. He stumbled beside me, but he didn't resist. I led us toward the embankment leading back to Highway 22, firing a round over each shoulder as we raced. The beams of our flashlights slammed against the undergrowth. One snagged on a low limb, wincing as I lunged to clear it. Behind us, the figures veered left, melting into the trees at the edge of our light. My father didn't slow until we burst back onto the highway's cracked shoulder. We skidded to a halt. The blacktop was slick with dew, reflecting the moon like a pool of mercury. The sedan was gone, but an unmarked truck idled on the far shoulder, lights off. K9 had arrived without sirens. Uniformed officers piled out, weapons drawn. I barked orders as Dad sank to his knees, sliding the revolver aside. One officer shone a spotlight on us, bleaching the night into raw white. They cuffed my father gently, murmuring that we would sort out what happened. I shook my head, spirit hollow. I wanted to argue, to swear I could handle this, but my voice cracked. One sergeant jogged over. "You okay, Mitchell?" He glanced at Dad's wallet in my hand. "We got your call. Found the other vehicle. Looks like someone staged it. We're pulling medics." I cut him off. "Someone staged it?" I stared at my father's blood-spattered hands, at the damp earth on our boots. The forest loomed behind us, silent once more. "It's not staged. It's real." Something inside me broke, and my knees buckled. I sank onto the asphalt, head in hands. The sirens were silent. The fog drifted free across the road. My father sat beside me, battered but alive, still staring at the distant tree line where the shapes had vanished. No one spoke. Not one radio transmitted across the night. No one knew how to explain the impossible. The ambulance doors shut with a dull thud behind me, sealing the forest's hush out, and the world shrank to fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, and the muted beeping of monitors. I sat on the gurney beside Dad, his head lolled against the pillow, eyes closed as the medic probed his bruises, his jacket stained with dark flecks I couldn't quite name. My uniform felt heavy, soaked with mud and something fouler that I didn't dare inspect. The EMT glanced at me, brow furrowed. "Officer Mitchell, you okay to ride back, or do you want to wait at the station?" I pressed my lips together, then nodded. "I'm fine." Lying would have been easier. Admitting I wasn't fine would have meant facing the nightmares. They strapped me in, and we set off, sirens silent now, headlights cutting through the mist like twin swords. Inside the ambulance, the air felt thin, each breath an effort. Dad's breathing was uneven, shallow gasps between bouts of coughing. I reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. He stirred, eyelids fluttering, and when they opened, his gaze was unfocused, haunted. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. I knelt to catch his words. Waiting. His voice cracked. In the station. Don't trust. Before he could finish, the lights of Sweetwater County lockup came into view. The medic gave me a look. We're here. I swallowed back the echo of my father's warning as the doors swung open. In the booking area, uniformed officers processed Dad with clinical efficiency. Fingerprints, photographs, standard procedure for anyone found injured with no clear assailant. I stayed close, watching the deputies' faces grow uneasy when they examined his blood-smeared badge imprint. Finally, they led him through a heavy door marked Interview Room 3. I hesitated in the corridor, hands shoved into my pockets, mind racing. Part of me wanted to follow. Part screamed at me to run back into those woods and never come out. Instead, I wandered to my cruiser, keys jingling in my hand, and pulled out Dad's wallet. Inside, I found his driver's license, a faded photo of Mom, and tucked behind it, a single slip of paper I hadn't seen before. No address, no number, just one word in block letters. Belong. My fingers itched to tear it apart, but I folded it carefully and pocketed it. I stepped into the interview room, the pane of one-way glass glowing dimly with the corridor's fluorescent light. Dad sat at the metal table, arms crossed, head bowed. His hair hung in damp strands across his forehead, and the knot of tension in his shoulders looked like it was digging into his spine. I eased the door closed behind me and took the empty chair opposite him. He looked up, surprised, maybe relieved, maybe frightened. I told him I'd come to hear him out, that I needed to understand what happened. He stared at me, eyes rimmed red, and finally he spoke. It started after you left, he said, voice distant. I tried to follow your path, hoping to find you, to keep you safe. But something snapped in the trees, something ancient. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something folded, another scrap, this time a fragment of a photograph. I grabbed it. It showed my father in uniform, years younger, standing before the same logging road, but behind him, ghostly pale, was a faint figure, too blurred to make out. Someone had scrawled on the back, "We remember." My stomach clenched. "Dad," I whispered. "That's..." His hand fell across mine, cold and insistent. "They're watching. They always have." His voice dropped so low I leaned in. "These woods. My grandfather used to talk about them. He said something lived there. Something that fed on memories, on bloodlines, on the echoes of our past. We thought it a legend, but tonight I found proof." He nodded toward the window. "Did you see the way they moved? Like shadows, but with purpose." I swallowed, recalling the tall shapes in oilskin coats, the way they advanced without sound. "What do they want?" I asked. He closed his eyes. "To reclaim what was taken, to bring us back where we came from." My skin crawled. "To take us where?" He opened his eyes, gaze piercing. "Home," he whispered, "where we always belonged." A knock at the door jolted us. 2 detectives poked their heads in, badges flashing. "Officer Mitchell, Detective Ruiz, you're cleared to leave. Your statement's on file." They nodded at my father. "Mr. Mitchell, we'll need you in the morgue later for the test results." Dad's head snapped up. "Morgue?" The detectives exchanged glances. "There was a body pulled from the ditch," one said. "Female, mid-30s, no ID. We thought..." Dad's face went pale. "That's not me." He stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "I'm not..." The detectives held up their hands. "Sir, please," I intervened. "He's my father. He's injured, traumatized. I'll handle it." The detectives nodded, reluctantly. "We'll arrange medical clearance and follow-up." They left. Dad sank back into his chair, trembling. The veneer of official procedure cracked, and the room felt smaller, the walls bulging inward. I sat beside him, handed him a water cup. "We'll get through this," I said, though my own voice wavered. He looked at me, tears brimming behind steely resolve. "I saw her," he said, "in the trees, a woman calling my name. She begged me to come back. I thought it was you." He pressed his palm to his chest. "It wasn't you." I nodded, torn between fear and a need to protect him. "We'll figure it out together." We left the station in Dad's car, headlights carving a path back toward the logging road. The radio was silent. The world had reverted to its ordinary hum. In the passenger seat, Dad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, knuckles white on the steering wheel. We passed mile marker 41, the ditch where the first sedan lay, and my blood ran cold as the road stretched past. He didn't slow. He didn't speak. Then, at the point where the logging road branched off, he swerved onto the gravel, tires hissing. I caught my breath. "Dad, what are you—" He raised a finger, silencing me, and guided the car deep into the forest again. The cabin he'd grown up in, abandoned for decades, rose from the trees like a fallen sentinel when we arrived. Its windows were dark hollows. The porch sagged under rotted boards. He killed the lights and the engine, and we sat in silence, engine ticking. Then he reached into the glove box and pulled out a brass key, tarnished and cold. "This belonged to your great-grandfather," he said softly. "He locked the door for a reason." He handed me the key, and in the moonlight I saw a faint inscription: "Enter at your own risk." My pulse stuttered. We climbed out, boots crunching. The door creaked open, and the air inside smelled of mildew and old paper. Dad held his flashlight steady. "Come on," he said, voice hollow. We stepped across the threshold together, father and son, into the darkness that had been waiting. We crossed the threshold, and the door groaned shut behind us, its latch engaging with an echo that swallowed our footsteps. The cabin's gloom was absolute. Only the narrow beam of my flashlight cut a swath through the darkness, illuminating peeling floral wallpaper turned gray with age and damp, a threadbare curtain hanging limp at a single window. The air was stale, tinged with something metallic. Old blood, I thought, and the sour tang of mold. My father stood rigid beside me, face pale in the film of my light, eyes darting as if he expected the walls themselves to breathe. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "Dad," I rasped, voice too loud, too brittle. He didn't answer. Slowly, he stepped forward, toward a low mantel over a decrepit stone hearth. On it lay a collection of objects: tarnished brass candlesticks, no candles, an iron keyring heavy with keys of every shape, and a thick leather-bound book cracked along the spine. I crouched to inspect the book. Its cover bore no title, but the edges of its pages were scorched. My fingers trembled as I flipped it open. The first page held a faded photograph, a stern-faced man in early 1900s uniform, standing before this very cabin, an infant cradled at his side. Scribbled beneath it in spidery handwriting, "We begin again." A creak to my left snapped my head up. My father had moved toward the back wall where a trap door lay concealed beneath a tatty rug. He knelt, sliding the rug aside. The trap door's iron handle was tarnished but intact. He looked back at me, jaw clenched. "They're down there," he said without emotion. I felt bile surge in my stomach. They being those shadow figures who had marked our initials in the mud, who now hunted us across decades. I should have argued, should have insisted on backup, but I didn't, because I believed him. He yanked the handle. The door lifted with a screech like a dying thing. Below, a ladder's rungs disappeared into darkness. A cool draft rose up, carrying with it a whisper I couldn't place, a voice calling a name I half recognized. I stepped closer. "Dad, wait." But he was already descending. I followed. The air grew colder, thicker, until the beam of my light trembled in my grip as it tried to penetrate the black. The ladder ended at a dirt floor, an underground chamber roughly hewn, walls lined with wooden shelves that sagged beneath dusty bottles, jars, boxes. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, but it was unlit, its filament broken. We stood side by side in that subterranean shrine. My father's face was drawn, ashen. He moved toward a shelf where dozens of metal rings lay in neat rows. Each ring was engraved with initials: ML, SM, JR, dozens more. Names I didn't know. Dust-coated fragments of what looked like newspaper clippings lay beneath them. I knelt and cleared dust from one clipping. "Fisherman disappears near mile marker 41, the headline read. Another: young woman missing after solo hike in Sweetwater Woods. Beneath each was a ring bearing her initials, scratched deep. My father slid a ring from the rack and held it out. Its letters, GM, glinted in the weak halo of flashlight. His hand shook so violently I stepped forward to take it. The instant my skin touched the cold metal, a jolt shot up my arm like his memories crashing into mine. He whispered, "They're collectors." My heart thundered. "Collecting what?" I asked. "Us," he said. "Our grief, our fear, our last moments." He dropped the ring. It landed with a hollow clink against the floor. I looked up, his face contorted in pain. "They feed on it, Sarah. They keep us trapped until they have enough." He clenched his fists. "Enough for what?" I stammered. He shook his head. "I don't know." Footsteps above us, soft, deliberate, made us both freeze. A voice, high and laced with cruelty, floated down. "They returned." My flashlight swung upward. At the trapdoor, two figures leaned through the opening, their faces now visible, pale as ash, eyes sunken but glittering, the same oilskin coats, the same narrow frame. But those faces, I recognized the features blurred in the old photograph on the mantel. One was the soldier in uniform, the other, a baby with hollow eyes. Both wore our family bloodline like a curse. My father stood, placing himself between me and the ladder. "Go," he hissed. "Find help." My chest tightened. "I'm not leaving you." He stepped forward, raising his hand toward the figures. "You must. You're the only one who can." Then he turned and sprinted deeper into the chamber, his form swallowed by shadow. I ran after him, breath ragged. The walls closed in as he disappeared around a curve. My light revealed more shelves, hundreds of rings, dusty tomes, shards of photographs, all remnants of vanished lives. The second figure appeared in the beam behind me, stepping lightly down the ladder. My skin crawled as I realized I was alone down here, far from the safety of my cruiser or my training. I forced the beam upward as the creature descended behind me. Its mouth opened in a mimicry of a grin. I backed away, heart pounding, and collided with a shelf, sending rings clattering across the dirt floor. The hollow echoes sounded like distant screams. I scrambled to my feet, scanning for my father, but only saw another corridor, yawning black. Summoning every ounce of courage, I plunged forward, the beam quivering in my grasp. I followed the tunnel until it curved and descended further, the weight of earth above pressing in. The air grew brackish, and I tasted something acrid, old rot, old tears. At a fork, I chose right, guided by a faint glimmer, light spilling from an arched opening. I burst through and found myself in a larger chamber, walls lined with portraits in tarnished frames. Each portrait depicted a member of my family, generations back, some in sepia, some in oil paint. Every face wore the same haunted expression, eyes wide with guilt and sorrow. At the center of the room stood an ornate oak chair, and seated in it was my father. His uniform was tattered, sleeves torn, one cheek bruised. He sat with his head bowed, hands resting on his knees. I raced to his side. "Dad!" I knelt beside him, touching his shoulder. He looked up, eyes glassy with tears. Behind him, carved into the plaster above an archway, were words in archaic script. "Blood remembers its own," he whispered, voice lost to exhaustion. "They told me. I belong here." I pulled him to his feet. "Let's go," I said, swallowing bile. He leaned on me, and we turned toward the corridor, but the portraits seemed to shift, their eyes following us. I shone the light on a painting of my mother, her face soft, mourning, and beneath it a ring suspended by a thread through a nail. M.L. Sarah Mitchell. My name. Panic seized me. They want me," I stuttered, breath catching. My father whispered, "They need a new story, a new closure." The hallway behind us darkened. I pressed us forward toward the exit. We had come full circle. The trapdoor's ladder loomed ahead, but the hatch had closed, sealed as if never opened. I yanked and kicked. The iron latch refused to budge. The wing of my flashlight caught a symbol carved into the wood. That single word, home, followed by another, inside. My father slid to his knees beside me, voice hollow. "We're the collection now." My throat tightened. I crouched and pried at the hatch's edges. Splinters bit into my palms. The creatures emerged from the portrait's edges, slithering into the room, those with baby faces, the soldier, others I recognized from the rings, cousins, neighbors, strangers. They closed in, silent but for a soft murmur. "Stay, you belong." My father gripped my arm. "Listen," he rasped. "They can't keep you if you refuse to stay." I swallowed past terror. "How do I—" He opened his palm, revealing a key, one of the brass ring keys from the mantel upstairs. He thrust it at me. "Find the lock." I looked up and noticed a keyhole carved into the stone base of the chair, hidden where the cushion should lock. I slid the key in, twisted.
A grinding sound. The chair's wooden planks parted, revealing a narrow shaft dropping into absolute black.
My father held out his hand. "Jump." My rational mind screamed, "No, don't jump. It's suicide." But behind me, the figures advanced, reaching with gaunt hands. I gripped my father's hand. "Together." He nodded, a flicker of relief shining through his exhaustion. We stepped onto the chair's hidden platform and let go, plunging into a tunnel of moonlight that shot upward like a lighthouse beacon. We fell, weightless, until we tumbled onto cold grass at the edge of the forest. The cabin sat above us, dark and silent. I pulled my father up as dawn's first light brushed the treetops. He coughed, life flickering in his eyes. We staggered toward the highway, where my cruiser sat idling, door ajar. I sank into the driver's seat, slamming the door. Dad collapsed into the passenger side, safe, but changed. I turned the key. The engine roared. Before I could shift into gear, my phone buzzed. A text from dispatch. "All units, we've had reports of 911 hang-ups all night along Highway 22. Caller ID traces to various local numbers. No voices ever heard. Be advised, suspect, unknown." My hands shook on the wheel. I glanced at my father, alive, trembling beside me. I whispered, "We made it out." A breeze rattled the trees, carrying a whisper we both heard. "Come home." I shut my eyes as the text continued to ping. Another. "All missing persons believed connected to local forest legend. Proceed with caution." My chest tightened. The forest loomed at the edge of my vision. I glanced again at Dad, safe for now, and started to drive away. But as the cruiser surged forward, I realized the dispatcher's text had one final line. "Unit 14, you are overdue for a wellness check. Status, missing. Home. Where do you go when even your badge says you no longer belong?"